Imagine stepping onto a football field in the 1950s. There is no music blasting from loudspeakers, no rows of trainers stretching athletes with bands, no hydration tables lined with energy drinks. Instead, the air is thick with dust. The grass is worn to dirt in patches. Helmets are made of thin plastic with single-bar face masks. Shoulder pads are hard leather, cracked at the edges. And lining the sideline, no doctors, no medical tents, no concussion protocol. Just a couple of coaches in rolled-up sleeves, whistles around their necks, ready to push men to the breaking point. This was professional football in its rawest, most unforgiving form. And the men who played it, especially the quarterbacks, were treated not as stars, but as just another body on the field. Now imagine Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson running onto that same field. Within a single practice, today's MVPs would be shocked at what passed for normal. No one counted reps, no one tracked workload. Coaches demanded hitting over and over, at full speed. Water breaks. They didn't exist. Trainers at the time genuinely believed drinking water during practice made players soft. Men collapsed from exhaustion under the scorching sun, and the response was simple. Get up. Toughen up. Keep going. The quarterbacks were not spared. They weren't protected. They weren't even seen as valuable assets. Coaches in the 1950s barked at quarterbacks to dive into tackling drills with linebackers. They were thrown into full-contact scrimmages where blitzers came free on every snap, encouraged to hit the passer as hard as possible. If a quarterback broke his ribs, the replacement wasn't another finely tuned specialist, was usually a halfback or defensive back stepping in, because no one cared enough to preserve the starter. It was brutal, it was punishing, and for the men who lived through it, it was normal. One player remembered those practices as nothing short of survival. Another described hazing rituals where rookies were beaten with taped-up helmets or tied to goalposts as veterans pelted them with footballs. If you complained, you were labeled soft. If you resisted, you risked being cut. Coaches turned a blind eye, because in that era, toughness wasn't just part of the game, was the game. Now let's pause and imagine the reaction if an NFL coach tried that today. If Sean McVay, Andy Reid, or Mike Tomlin ran two-a-day practices with no water breaks, forced star quarterbacks into full-contact hitting drills, or ignored hazing in the locker room, the outcry would be instant. Social media would explode. Parents would demand accountability. The league office would issue suspensions. Hey, within days, those coaches would be unemployed. That's the difference between then and now. In the 1950s, there were no cameras, no public relations departments, no union fighting for players' rights. Coaches ruled like dictators. They answered to no one, and their word was final. But here's the shocking truth. The toughness forged in those conditions helped shape the foundation of the modern NFL. The players who endured the 1950s paid a price physically, mentally, and emotionally, but they also laid the groundwork for the safety protocols, the oversight, and the protections we now take for granted. Think about the racism players faced. In the 1950s, black athletes fought not only opponents, but also the prejudice of teammates, fans, and even coaches. Some teams quietly imposed quotas, refusing to carry too many black players. Rookies were hazed more harshly. Veterans sometimes refused to block for black quarterbacks. And hotel staff in certain cities wouldn't allow them to stay with their white teammates. Yet these men pushed forward, not just surviving, but excelling, breaking down barriers that would change the game forever. Now compare that to today. Patrick Mahomes is the face of the league. Jalen Hurts leads one of the NFL's most passionate fan bases. Russell Wilson, Lamar Jackson, and Dak Prescott are franchise quarterbacks with multi-million-dollar contracts. What was once unimaginable has become normal because of the sacrifices made in those early decades. Oversight was non-existent in the 1950s. Coaches weren't monitored by cameras in practice. They weren't reviewed by league officials. They weren't questioned about medical safety, about hazing, about racism. They had absolute power, and that power was often abused. But in their relentless pursuit of toughness, they unintentionally forced the sport to evolve. The brutality of that era drew public criticism. It sparked the beginnings of the Players' Union. It led to reform. And slowly, the NFL became not just a league of survival, but a league of strategy, innovation, and eventually superstars. So why does this matter? Because when we look back at the 1950s with modern eyes, the contrast is staggering. Practices that were once celebrated would now get coaches banned. Routines that built legends would today be considered criminal negligence. And the treatment of players, especially quarterbacks, was so unforgiving that it is almost impossible to believe the league survived it all. Yet it did. And not only did it survive, it grew. The NFL of the 1950s was dangerous, reckless, and raw. But out of that chaos came legends Johnny Unitas, throwing in the mud with broken fingers, Bobby Lane playing through hangovers and broken bones, Otto Graham taking hit after hit and still winning championships. These quarterbacks weren't protected. They weren't coddled. They were tested every single day by coaches, teammates, and the game itself. And through that test, they built the mythology of professional football. That's why this story is worth telling. Because to understand the NFL, we know today the high-tech training, the concussion protocol, the billion-dollar quarterbacks. You have to understand the fire they were forged in. The brutality of the 1950s shaped the path forward. And yet, if you transported those same coaching tactics to 2025, they wouldn't last 24 hours. Every headline would scream outrage. Every analyst would demand change. Every parent of a college recruit would steer their son away. The NFL would be forced to act immediately. The world has changed. The standards have changed. And the expectations of how athletes should be treated have changed. But the echoes of that past remain. They remind us that the league wasn't always glitz, glamour, and glory. It was once sweat, dirt, punishment, and pain. And those coaches, as brutal as they were, played a role in building the sport we love today. So here's the question we'll explore. What really happened on those fields in the 1950s? How violent were the practices? How far did hazing go? How deep did racism run? And why is it that the very men who once ruled the NFL sidelines with an iron fist would be fired in an instant if they coached today? This is not just a story about football. It's a story about change, about progress, about how far we VA command, about the men who endured the fire so the stars of today could shine brighter. Because the NFL of the 1950s was dangerous. But without it, the NFL of today might not exist at all. The 1950s were a defining decade for America. The nation had emerged from World War II with a new sense of confidence, a booming economy, and a rapidly expanding middle class. Suburban neighborhoods stretched across once empty fields. Families gathered around the television for the very first time. And for millions of people, Sunday afternoons meant one thing above all: football. It is hard to imagine now, but professional football in the early 1950s was still fighting for recognition. Baseball was the national pastime, boxing dominated headlines, and college football drew larger crowds than the fledgling NFL. Yet, beneath the surface, something was brewing. The game was raw, fast, and punishing. It didn't yet have the glitz of the Super Bowl, the billion-dollar TV deals, or the fantasy leagues that drive today's fandom. What it had instead was grit, sacrifice, and a relentless intensity that captured the spirit of the era. At the heart of that intensity were the coaches. These men were more than strategists. They were disciplinarians, motivators, and, in many ways, cultural mirrors of the 1950s. Their methods reflected the values of post-war America: toughness, conformity, and obedience. This was a time when questioning authority was rare. Factories demanded loyalty. Schools enforced rigid discipline. The military drafted millions of young men into service. In football, the coaches were unquestioned generals, and their word was absolute law. But here's the striking truth. If those very same coaching methods were used today, then the NFL of 2025, they would not only spark outrage, but likely get coaches fired on the spot. Why? Because the football of the 1950s was built on practices and philosophies that today would be seen as dangerous, unethical, and deeply out of step with modern values. This isn't to say that the coaches of that era were villains. In fact, many of them were beloved, respected, and even admired for their commitment to the game. They helped shape football into the sport it would become. But when you examine their day-to-day methods, violent practices, hazing rituals, racial discrimination, and an almost complete lack of oversight, you begin to see just how far the game has evolved. To understand this transformation, we have to step back and look at America itself in the 1950s. It was an age of optimism and anxiety at the same time. The suburbs promised stability, but the Cold War loomed in the background. The civil rights movement was beginning to stir, challenging deep-seated racial barriers. Gender roles were rigid, workplaces were hierarchical, and conformity was prized over individuality. Football fit neatly into this picture. It was a sport that valued toughness above all. It's a sport that rewarded players who put the team before themselves. A sport that taught obedience to authority without question. For coaches, that meant their power was virtually unchecked. There were no unions protecting players, no independent medical staff looking out for their health, and no cameras broadcasting every detail of practice. A coach could run his team however he wanted. That meant 3-hour hitting sessions in the blazing sun with no water breaks. So be it. If that meant publicly humiliating rookies to toughen them up, nobody batted an eye. If that meant benching or cutting a player simply because of his race, very few people had the power war, the platform to challenge it. This might sound shocking today, but at the time, it was normalized. People believed that football was supposed to be hard. It was supposed to test your limits. It was supposed to separate the weak from the strong. And for many young men, especially those who had grown up in the shadow of war, that kind of toughness was seen as a badge of honor. But football's place in the 1950s wasn't just about toughness on the field. It also mirrored broader struggles in society. African American players, for example, were beginning to break into the league. But they faced constant discrimination from coaches, teammates, and fans. Opportunities were limited, positions were often restricted, and racist assumptions shaped who was allowed to play where. Many coaches reinforced these barriers, consciously or unconsciously, because they reflected the prejudices of the time. Looking back, it is clear that this was one of the darkest aspects of the 1950s NFL, a reminder of how sports are never separate from the society in which they exist. And then there was the question of health and safety, or, more accurately, the lack of it. The idea of protecting players from concussions or long-term injuries was virtually non-existent. Coaches saw injuries as a test of character. A player who got knocked unconscious was often sent back in the game once he shook it off. Water breaks were seen as a sign of weakness. Painkillers were handed out without much thought about their long-term effects. Again, nobody saw this as reckless at the time. It was simply the way things were done. Contrast that with today's NFL. Every game is monitored by medical spotters. Concussion protocols remove players instantly if there is even a hint of head trauma. Racial barriers have been challenged and broken, and diversity is celebrated as a strength of the league. Hazing is no longer tolerated, and the idea of coaches humiliating players would spark national debates within hours on social media. In many ways, the NFL has become not just safer, but more reflective of modern values that prioritize fairness, inclusion, and accountability. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. For all the flaws of the 1950s, for all the brutality and outdated ideas, those coaches still left a lasting mark on the game. They instilled discipline. They built loyalty. They demanded effort and commitment in ways that still echo through locker rooms today. Without them, football might not have survived long enough to become the cultural giant it is now. Their methods may be obsolete, but their impact is undeniable. This is why looking back at the NFL of the 1950s is not just a history lesson, it's a chance to appreciate how far we've come. It's a reminder of the resilience of players who endured conditions that today would be unthinkable. And it's a way of recognizing the broader changes in American society, where the unquestioned authority of the past has slowly given way to a world where fairness, safety, and accountability matter more. Over the course of this series, we will explore these themes in depth. We will look at the violent practice cultures that left players battered before they ever reached game day. We will uncover the hazing rituals that blurred the line between tradition and abuse. We will examine the racial dynamics of the era and the struggles faced by black athletes breaking barriers in an unforgiving environment. And we will see how, over time, players, fans, and even coaches themselves began to demand something better. The story of the 1950s NFL is, in many ways, the story of America itself. It is a story of progress and struggle, of pain and triumph, of traditions that needed to be broken, and of values that still resonate. To understand why NFL coaches of the 1950s would be fired today, we first need to step inside their world, not to judge it with today's eyes, but to see it as it truly was, to feel the weight of its challenges, and to grasp the full arc of transformation that has taken place. And that is where we begin. Our first stop is the practice field. Not the gleaming training complexes of today, with air-conditioned weight rooms and hydration specialists, but the dusty, brutal, sweat-soaked grind of the 1950s. Here, in these forgotten practice fields, the story of football's toughest, most punishing era truly begins. When we talk about football in the 1950s, the first thing that often comes to mind is toughness. Not just the kind of toughness we see today, with players battling through grueling games and carefully monitored practices. No, the toughness of the 1950s was something far more raw, far less controlled, and at times, shockingly brutal. Practices were not just preparation. They were tests of survival. For many young men, stepping onto the practice field in those days felt like stepping into a controlled war zone, where the goal wasn't just improvement, but domination at all costs. Imagine being a 21-year-old rookie in 1955, fresh out of college, thrilled to get your chance in the National Football League. You walk onto the practice field for the first time, and before the whistle even blows, the veterans size you up. They know you're fresh meat. There are no protections, no oversight, no union to make sure you're safe. The coaches standing on the sideline with stern faces and folded arms aren't there to shield you from danger. In fact, sometimes they encourage it. To them, breaking you down was part of building you up. And if you couldn't handle it, then you didn't belong in the NFL. Practices in that era often looked more violent than actual games. Scrimmages were full contact every single rep. There was no such thing as a thud drill where you hit and hold back. Every drill was live, and every tackle was meant to flatten you into the dirt. Coaches would sometimes order players to keep going even after the whistle blew, grinding each other into the grass long after a play should have been dead. Bruises, concussions, and bloody noses weren't signs of concern. They were badges of honor. Players wore them proudly because that was the only way to prove to the team and to the coach that you were worthy of being there. Now compare that to today's NFL. In the modern league, practice is heavily regulated. Teams are limited by collective bargaining agreements on how many padded practices they can have, how long they can run, even how many hours a player can spend on the field. Safety protocols are written into the very fabric of the schedule. Players are monitored by medical staff, and if someone takes a hard hit in practice, they're often pulled immediately for evaluation. This isn't weakness, it's progress. It's the recognition that preserving a player's health leads to a longer, stronger career, and ultimately, better football for the fans. But in the 1950s, the culture was entirely different. Pain was expected, demanded even, and the idea of protecting players from themselves was considered laughable. Think about the impact that had on players' bodies, without modern training staffs, without the careful oversight of doctors and athletic trainers. Many men carried injuries into games that should have sidelined them for weeks. Ankles were taped tightly, ribs were wrapped, and heads that had just been rattled by concussions were sent right back into the huddle. To the coaches of the time, pain was a tool. It was something to be exploited, not managed. They believed that if you could endure the punishment in practice, you'd be twice as effective in games, and in many ways, they were right. Games in the 1950s were filled with some of the hardest-hitting football the sport has ever seen. But at what cost? The psychological toll was just as real as the physical one. Rookies were often singled out, targeted in drills by veterans who wanted to test their toughness. Coaches didn't stop it. Sometimes they orchestrated it. They wanted to see if the new kid would crack under the pressure. If you dropped the ball after a hit, if you stayed down too long, if you showed even a hint of weakness, you were labeled as soft. And in the 1950s NFL, that label was a death sentence for your career. Players knew they couldn't let pain show, because pain meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant you wouldn't last. What makes this even more striking is how fans and the media glorified it. Newspaper articles often describe practices as battles or wars, praising the coaches for driving their men into the ground to get them ready for Sundays. The culture of the sport fed into the larger culture of post-war America, where toughness, resilience, and masculinity were deeply tied to one another. In a nation recovering from World War II and entering the Cold War era, football became a stage where toughness was not just entertainment, it was a statement of values. Players weren't just athletes, they were warriors, and practice was their proving ground. But as romantic as that may sound, the reality was often grim. Players broke bones in practice and played the next day. They tore ligaments without surgery because surgery wasn't even an option most of the time. They absorbed repeated blows to the head long before we understood the long-term effects of concussions. And all of this wasn't happening under the bright lights of Sunday afternoon. It was happening in the mud, the sweat, and the dirt of weekday practices, hidden away from the public eye. Now, here's the big question. Why would coaches run practices this way? Why would they risk injuring their own players before the games even started? The answer lies in the mindset of the time. In the 1950s, football was fighting for survival. It wasn't the billion-dollar powerhouse it is today. Players weren't celebrities. They were barely making a living wage. Coaches knew that the only way to draw fans was to put the toughest, hardest-hitting product possible on the field. And to them, the best way to create that product was to make practice even more brutal than the games. If you could survive Monday through Friday, Sunday would feel like a relief. From today's perspective, it's easy to see how flawed this thinking was. Injuries cut short countless promising careers. Players left the game battered and broken. Their bodies aged decades beyond their years. Some could barely walk by the time they retired, while others struggled with chronic pain for the rest of their lives. And yet, in that time and place, it was considered normal. Coaches believed they were doing their jobs by pushing players to their absolute limits. Looking back, it's remarkable to see how far the game has come. Today, we celebrate the toughness of the players, but we also celebrate the brilliance of the sport. The strategy, the skill, the precision, it all shines brighter when players are healthy enough to showcase it. The violent practices of the 1950s may have forged some legends, but they also robbed the game of countless others who never got the chance to reach their full potential. And that's the power of history. By understanding where the game came from, by remembering the pain and sacrifice of those early players, we can appreciate the progress that has been made. The modern NFL is faster, smarter, and yes, safer, not because the players are any less tough, but because the game has learned from its past. As we continue this journey, we'll dive deeper into the practices, the culture, and the reality of football in the 1950s. Next, we'll look at something even darker than the violent practices, The hazing rituals that turned teammates into tormentors. If you thought practice was brutal, wait until you see how rookies were welcomed into the league. Imagine stepping into an NFL locker room in the 1950s as a young rookie. You've just been drafted or signed, carrying your dreams, your pride, and maybe the hopes of your family on your shoulders. For many, this was the culmination of years of sacrifice, of playing through pain in high school, of grinding through college football when scholarships were rare luxuries. Yet, before you could even think about proving yourself on the field, you had to survive something else entirely: hazing. Hazing wasn't just a few pranks or some harmless teasing. It was a system. It was tradition. It was culture. And in the NFL of the 1950s, it was brutal. Today, when you hear the word hazing, you might think of college fraternities or some rookie having to sing his school's fight song in front of veterans. But in the 1950s NFL, hazing could break a man before he even had the chance to lace up his cleats for real action. Players have shared stories of being tied to goalposts in the blistering sun after practice, left there until someone remembered to cut them down. Rookies had their clothes stolen, their shoes cut to pieces, or their heads shaved in bizarre, humiliating patterns. Some were taped to benches, covered in shaving cream, or stuffed into lockers. These might sound childish by today's standards, but in the 1950s, the undertone was different. It wasn't about laughs. It was about dominance. It was about testing whether you belonged. The veterans wanted to know, could you take it? Could you endure humiliation, exhaustion, and pressure without quitting? Could you show that you had the grit, the toughness, a mental steel to survive in a league where rosters were smaller? Contracts weren't guaranteed, and every day felt like a fight to keep your job. Hazing was framed as a rite of passage, but to rookies, it was often a gauntlet. One infamous tradition involved rookie dinners. On the surface, that doesn't sound too bad. You take the veterans out for a nice meal, right? But in the 1950s, these dinners were financial ambushes. Rookies, who often made only a few $1,000s for the entire season, were forced to foot massive bills at high-end restaurants. Imagine working your entire off-season job: construction, teaching, sales, whatever kept you afloat, only to have a chunk of it wiped out in one night just to satisfy the egos of veterans. For many, that financial hit was devastating. And then there were the violent forms. Reports from the era describe rookies being forced into boxing matches against seasoned veterans. Gloves were thrown on them, and suddenly they were in the middle of the locker room with teammates cheering, jeering, and swinging at them. It wasn't sparring. It was punishment disguised as tradition. And in a time when concussions weren't even officially recognized, you can imagine how dangerous those fights could be. There's a story told about a rookie lineman in the late 1950s who refused to take part in a hazing ritual. He stood up to the veterans, saying he wouldn't be humiliated. The next day, in practice, he was targeted on every drill. Every hit was a little harder. Every block aimed to break him down. By the end of camp, he was cut. That's the kind of pressure rookies faced. You could fight the hazing, but the system usually won. Now, let's pause and think about why this culture existed. The 1950s NFL was a league still fighting for respect. Baseball was America's game. Boxing and horse racing drew bigger headlines. Football wasn't the billion-dollar empire we know today. For many veterans, protecting their spot in the league was about survival. Hazing was their way of enforcing hierarchy, of reminding rookies that nothing came easy. You had to earn your place, and the veterans made sure you felt that truth in every possible way. Of course, there were players who saw through the cruelty. Some veterans went easy on rookies, welcoming them instead of breaking them. But they were the minority. The dominant culture was clear. Endure the hazing, prove your toughness, or you didn't belong. Compare that to today's NFL. Modern rookie rituals still exist, but they look vastly different. You might see a first-round draft pick carrying veterans' pads after practice. You might hear about a rookie standing on a chair in the cafeteria singing his college fight song. There are still rookie dinners, sure, but with multi-million-dollar contracts. A big tab at a steakhouse doesn't carry the same sting. And importantly, today's NFL has player unions, player engagement programs, and social media exposure. Extreme hazing would be called out, punished, and condemned almost immediately. It's a reminder of how far the league has come. In the 1950s, a rookie who spoke up had no platform. No one outside the locker room would hear his voice. Today, a single tweet or Instagram post could set off headlines across the sports world. The power balance has shifted. Players are protected in ways they never were before. And yet, even in the toughness of those old traditions, there's a strange paradox. For some players, hazing did forge bonds. For others, it planted resentment that lasted entire careers. Think about that dynamic. Some rookies endured the humiliation and came out with veteran approval, building lifelong friendships. Others never forgot the pain, carrying bitterness even as they became veterans themselves. This cycle often repeated. Yesterday's victim became tomorrow's hazer. The culture sustained itself because players felt that enduring it had been their price of entry, so the next generation had to pay too. When you step back and look at it, hazing in the 1950s was both a mirror of the sport and of society. Football was violent, hierarchical, and unforgiving. So is hazing. But society at large was also in flux. The 1950s were an era of strict social rules, rigid hierarchies, and silent suffering. Men were expected to endure hardship without complaint to prove themselves in silence. Hazing fit neatly into that worldview. It's only in hindsight that we can see how damaging it was. How many careers ended not because of lack of talent, but because rookies were broken before they ever had a chance? How many futures were stolen by a culture that mistook cruelty for strength? These are the questions history forces us to ask. And as we close this chapter on hazing, we step into the next layer of the 1950s. NFL story. The social barriers that went beyond locker room pranks or traditions. Because while hazing was about testing toughness, there was another force in that era that tested humanity itself. The racial barriers of the 1950s NFL were every bit as harsh, every bit as defining, and shaped the league's path in ways that hazing never could. That's where we go next. When we step back into the 1950s, the NFL presents an image of a league on the rise. A sport gaining momentum in America's cultural bloodstream. The crowds were swelling, the rivalries were fierce, and the Sunday rituals were becoming a staple of American life. But behind that growing spectacle lay a painful truth, one that shaped players' lives just as much as the hits on the field. That truth was racism, embedded not only in society, but in the very fabric of professional football. It is hard to imagine today watching a league where black quarterbacks lead franchises, where legends like Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and Russell Wilson inspire millions. That only a few decades ago, the very position of quarterback was essentially off-limits to black athletes. In the 1950s, NFL teams openly refused to draft black players in certain roles. Coaches and owners often justified it with coded language, claiming black athletes lacked leadership or football intelligence. In reality, it was systemic exclusion and unwritten rule that kept opportunities unequal. And yet, through those barriers, some pioneers forced their way forward. Names like Marion Motley and Bill Willis come to mind, men who joined the Cleveland Browns before the 1950s, breaking down color lines, facing hostility, and proving on the field what was long denied off it. Their presence was not just about football, was about resilience. Every yard they gained, every block they threw, was a statement to the league and to America. Talent cannot be denied forever. But make no mistake, playing in the NFL as a black man in the 1950s was not simply about football. It was about survival. Players spoke of being barred from team hotels in certain cities, forced to eat separately from their teammates, or denied service in restaurants while traveling with their teams. Imagine the heartbreak. Playing your heart out on Sunday, representing your franchise. Hearing your name cheered in the stadium and then being told you could not even share a meal with the men you battled beside. That was the reality. The locker rooms, too, were not always safe havens. Hazing and exclusion often took on racial tones. Some veterans treated black rookies with disdain, subjecting them to crueler initiations or ostracizing them altogether. For these players, the bonds of brotherhood that football is meant to inspire were fractured by prejudice. And yet, even in that environment, many rose above, relying on their unmatched skill, determination, and unshakable will to prove that greatness knows no color. Think for a moment about the pressure. It was not enough simply to play well. Black players often felt they had to be better, stronger, faster, tougher just to hold on to a roster spot. Mistakes that a white player might recover from were, for them, career-threatening. One dropped pass, one missed assignment, and whispers of not good enough would surface not about their talent, but about their race. The weight of that double standard was immense. Yet, astonishingly, many of these men still excelled. Consider Willie Thrower. In 1953, he became the first black quarterback in the modern NFL when he entered a game for the Chicago Bears. His playing time was brief, and his opportunity limited, but the symbolism was monumental. Willie Thrower cracked the door open, even if only for a moment. Decades later, that small step would pave the way for others. Today, when we see diverse quarterbacks leading Super Bowl-winning teams, we can trace that lineage back to pioneers like Thrower, who carried the burden of history on his shoulders. And beyond the players themselves, there were ripple effects. The struggles of black athletes in the NFL mirrored the broader civil rights battles unfolding in America. Every insult endured, every discriminatory policy challenged. Every instance of quiet dignity in the face of prejudice, they became part of a larger movement toward equality. Football stadiums became microcosms of the country's struggles, where progress was slow, painful, but undeniable. Looking back, it is important to recognize the courage it took to simply keep showing up. Imagine walking into a locker room where you are not fully welcome. Imagine stepping onto a field where some opponents sand, even some teammates resent your very presence. And then imagine not just surviving, but excelling, refusing to let hate define your destiny. That is the legacy of those 1950s pioneers. Today, when we watch an NFL Sunday, we see rosters filled with diversity. We see Hall of Fame speeches from legends of every background. We see coaches, coordinators, and executives from across racial lines shaping the league. That progress is real land. It was bought with the sacrifices of those who endured the injustices of the 1950s. Their pain carved out a path for the game we love today. And it is worth asking, what if those men had not persevered? What if they had walked away, beaten down by the cruelty of the system? The NFL might look very different today. The stories we cherish, the stars we celebrate, the history we honor, none of it would exist in the same way. By standing firm, those athletes not only changed football, but also helped bend the arc of American sports toward justice. So when we examine racism in the 1950s NFL, we are not only confronting an ugly truth, we're also celebrating the strength of those who faced it. They turned barriers into stepping stones, insults into fuel, and exclusion into opportunity. Their legacy is not defined by the prejudice they endured, but by the progress they made possible. And as we move forward in this story, it becomes clear that the NFL of the 1950s was a crucible of both hardship and transformation. The violent practices tested players' bodies. Hazing tested their endurance. Racism tested their humanity. And yet, time and again, those players proved that the game and their spirit was stronger than any obstacle. Coming up next, we'll examine the fourth element of this era, the total lack of oversight. In a league where coaches ruled unchecked, players had little protection, and decisions often went unchallenged. What did it mean to play under those conditions? The answer reveals not just the toughness of the players, but the way their sacrifices laid the groundwork for the safeguards and fairness the NFL embraces today. Imagine a workplace where the boss could decide everything without accountability. No human resources. No league office breathing down his neck. No union protecting the workers. That was the NFL in the 1950s. Coaches were kings and players were subjects. The league had rules, but enforcement was weak. Oversight was virtually non-existent. For coaches, this meant total power. For players, it meant uncertainty, vulnerability, and sometimes outright mistreatment. This wasn't just football, it was a system built on control. A coach in that era could decide practice schedules, discipline methods, and even medical care. If he wanted a player to push through an injury, the player had no choice. If he believed a man wasn't tough enough, he might humiliate him in front of his teammates, or worse, cut him on the spot. There was no appeal process, no grievance system. The coach's word was final. To understand the gravity of this, imagine being a 24-year-old rookie who finally made it to training camp. You've dreamed about this your entire life. But the moment you step onto that field, you're no longer just an athlete, you're property. If you break your ankle, the team doctor who answers to the coach, not to who might tape it up, give you a painkiller, and send you back out. If it ends your career, so be it. There was no second opinion, no independent medical staff to protect you. And this wasn't rare. Players from that era have described locker rooms where painkillers and injections were handed out like candy, where limping onto the field wasn't heroic, was mandatory. Many would later admit they had no idea what was being pumped into their bodies. They were simply told to trust the staff and obey the coach. The lack of oversight didn't stop at health. It extended into money. Salaries were modest compared to today's astronomical contracts. A star player in the 1950s might earn $7,000 a season, about $80,000 in today's dollars. That wasn't enough to live comfortably year-round, especially with a family. Many players worked second jobs in the off-season, selling insurance, teaching school, or even working construction. If a coach or owner decided to pay less, there was no negotiating leverage. Contracts were one-sided. Holdouts were rare because players knew they could be replaced at a moment's notice. Even legends weren't immune. Johnny Unitas, now remembered as one of the greatest quarterbacks in history, was once cut by the Pittsburgh Steelers before he even played a game. Why? The coach didn't think he was good enough. There was no developmental squad, no safety net. Just a pink slip and the end of a dream. Unitas only got another chance because of pure luck. A semi-pro team in Pennsylvania kept him playing until the Baltimore Colts called. If that phone call never came, one of football's greatest stories would have ended before it began. And that was the reality. Careers could vanish overnight. Coaches had unchecked authority, and the league provided no oversight. The system tilted heavily in favor of management. Owners and coaches dictated everything, while players had no formal voice. It's hard to imagine today's NFL players living under that kind of power imbalance. Modern coaches answer to general managers, owners, league offices, the media, and, most importantly, the players' union. Safety protocols are enforced. Independent neurologists evaluate concussions. Contracts are negotiated under collective bargaining agreements. Players can file grievances. They can appeal suspensions. They have representation. The days of unchecked authority are gone. But in the 1950s, that world seemed normal. It mirrored much of American society at the time. Workplaces across the country often lacked unions or oversight. Factory workers, miners, and steel workers faced similar struggles: long hours, dangerous conditions, little recourse if management decided they were expendable. Football wasn't separate from that reality. It was simply another industry where power flowed one way downward. Yet, here's the paradox. From this environment of control and vulnerability, legends were forged. The men who survived the NFL of the 1950s were just tough athletes. They were survivors of a system designed to test their breaking point. They endured humiliation, low pay, and physical punishment, because the dream of playing professional football burned too brightly to give up. Ask yourself, what does it say about a man who would take all of that abuse, all of that risk, and still lace up his cleats every Sunday? It says he loved the game more than his own comfort. It says he was willing to risk everything for a chance to play. That kind of passion, born in an era of zero oversight, helped shape football into the emotional, high-stakes sport it is today. Still, make no mistake, today's NFL would never tolerate that world. Fans expect transparency. Players demand safety and fairness. Coaches are leaders, but they are not monarchs. The NFL has learned, sometimes the hard way, that accountability is not optional, it is essential. The evolution from zero oversight to today's checks and balances is part of what makes the league so powerful now. Fans trust that games are legitimate. Players know their health is protected. Contracts are real, enforceable, and fair. Coaches understand that leadership must be earned, not demanded. The balance has shifted, and the sport is stronger because of it. Looking back, the zero-oversight world of the 1950s feels almost unthinkable. It seems like a different universe. But it also serves as a reminder of how far the NFL has come. What was once a league of unchecked power is now a league of shared responsibility. That's growth worth celebrating. And yet there's another side to this story. For every step the NFL took toward accountability, there were dark moments that forced change. Oversight wasn't handed out willingly. It was demanded by players who suffered, by fans who demanded better, and by a culture that slowly recognized the human cost of neglect. Because the truth is, zero oversight didn't just make the league tough. It left scars, physical, financial, and emotional, that lasted long after players retired. It taught the NFL painful lessons about what happens when power is absolute. As we continue this journey, we'll explore how those lessons were learned. The brutality of violent practices, the cruelty of hazing, the sting of racism, and the reality of unchecked authority, all of these forces shaped the game. They tested the men who played it, and in doing so, they forced football to evolve. The NFL you see today, with all its power, wealth, and prestige, was built on the backs of men who played in a world without safety nets. And as we move forward, we'll see just how high that cost was. Next, we'll turn to one of the most difficult and often overlooked realities of that era: racism in the NFL. Because even as players fought through injuries and unfair treatment, many faced another battle entirely: the fight for equality in a league that didn't always welcome them. Imagine stepping onto a football field in the 1950s. The grass is torn up, the pads are thin, the helmets are made of hard plastic with little more than a chin strap for protection. No face guards at first, then single bars later on. The collisions sound like car crashes, but there's no concussion protocol, no neurologist waiting on the sidelines. If you got hit hard enough to see stars, the trainer would wave smelling salts under your nose and tell you to get back in there. That was the culture. That was the expectation. In this world, toughness wasn't optional, it was survival. And the brutality of the NFL during this time cannot be overstated. Practices were violent, games were punishing, and recovery was almost non-existent. Injuries were part of the job description, and playing hurt wasn't a choice, was mandatory. Consider Chuck Bednarik, nicknamed Concrete Charlie. He was the last of the true two-way players, anchoring the Philadelphia Eagles both as a center on offense and a linebacker on defense. For 60 minutes he hit, blocked, and tackled with relentless fury. His famous knockout of Frank Gifford in 1960 became one of the most iconic and horrifying images in NFL history. Gifford lay unconscious on the field for 18 months before returning to play. His career nearly ended in that one moment. But what's often forgotten is that this wasn't some freak accident in a violent sport. It was a reflection of how the game was played every single week. Brutality extended far beyond game day. Practices were essentially legalized hazing rituals. Coaches demanded all-out scrimmages, pitting teammates against each other in full-contact battles that left men battered before Sunday even arrived. Veterans targeted rookies, delivering extra hits to toughen them up. Players would tape coins inside their shoulder pads to make tackles sting harder. Bloodied noses, broken fingers, and dislocated shoulders were brushed aside as part of the grind. Racism added another cruel layer to the brutality. Black players not only endured the same physical punishment, but also faced segregation and hostility. In some cities, they weren't allowed to stay in the same hotels as white teammates. They heard slurs on the field, sometimes even from their own sideline. Coaches rarely intervened. The unspoken rule was simple. If you wanted to play in the NFL, you had to take it. Financial vulnerability compounded everything. With salaries barely scraping by, most players couldn't afford to miss time. If you were hurt, you taped it up and went out there anyway, because the man behind you on the depth chart was waiting to take your job. Many players worked off-season construction, sold insurance, or took warehouse shifts to make ends meet. Imagine pounding your body on the gridiron for 6 months, then hauling bricks in July just to pay the mortgage. That was the reality of being a professional football player in the so-called golden age of the NFL. And yet, out of this brutality came legends. Wyatt Tittle, bloodied and kneeling after a sack, became the face of perseverance. Johnny Unitas, with his flat-top haircut and unshakable calm, played through broken ribs and sprained ankles without ever complaining. Players like Sam Huff, the New York Giants linebacker, were celebrated not for avoiding pain, but for embracing it. Huff even starred in a CBS special titled The Violent World of Sam Huff, which proudly showcased the bone-crunching nature of his position. The violence wasn't hidden, it was marketed. Fans loved it. They saw these men as gladiators, and the NFL leaned into that image. But behind the highlight reels and the cheers were real consequences. Careers were cut short. Lifetimes were shortened. Many men from that era carried permanent injuries. Some walked with limps into their 40s. Some never walked again. Brain damage wasn't yet understood, but dementia and memory loss silently claimed dozens of former players. Families paid the price as husbands and fathers struggled with pain, depression, or poverty after their brief playing days were over. The NFL of the 1950s was brutal because it had to be. The league was still fighting for cultural legitimacy. Baseball was America's pastime. Boxing and horse racing drew bigger crowds. Football needed an edge, and its edge was violence. It was marketed as the toughest game a man could play, and the men who endured it wore their scars as badges of honor. Yet, as much as fans adored the violence, the brutality forced the NFL to evolve. It couldn't last forever. The human body has limits, and so does the tolerance of a society watching its heroes fall apart. In the shadows of the 1950s, questions began to simmer. Should there be limits on practice violence? Should players have pensions? Should injuries be taken more seriously? At the time, these questions were whispered, not shouted, but they were the seeds of change. This was the paradox of the NFL's brutality. It both elevated the league and threatened its survival. The spectacle drew fans, but the cost to players was unsustainable. The brutality made men legends, but it also broke them. And in breaking them, it forced the game to confront its own identity. Looking back now, the 1950s feel like a different planet. Today's NFL has concussion protocols, blue medical tents on the sidelines, and entire staffs dedicated to player safety. There are collective bargaining agreements, guaranteed contracts, and post-career benefits. Players can speak up about mental health without fear of being labeled weak. None of that existed in the 1950s. The brutality of that era was real, and it paved the way for everything that followed. So when we celebrate the toughness of that decade, we must also acknowledge the cost. For every highlight, there was a broken bone. For every celebrated knockout hit, there was a career ended too soon. For every cheer, there was a family dealing with the quiet consequences. The brutality of the 1950s NFL was not just a chapter in history, it was the crucible that shaped modern football. Without it, the league might never have grown into the juggernaut it is today. But with it, countless men paid a price few fans ever saw. And that is the legacy of the era. Heroes forged in pain, legends built on sacrifice, and a sport that had to learn the hard way that unchecked brutality comes with a bill. A bill the NFL is still paying in some ways today. As we move forward, we'll explore how the combination of this violence, the lack of oversight, the financial strain, and the racial divide set the stage for the rise of change. The brutality of the 1950s didn't end the NFL. It transformed it. It forced the league to adapt, to modernize, and to become something bigger than anyone in that era could have imagined. The brutality wasn't just football. It was survival. It was the foundation on which the modern NFL was built. Imagine a football game where almost every man on the field is hiding an injury. A broken finger taped to the next one. A knee that buckled last week, now wrapped in layers of elastic bandages. Shoulders barely able to lift, ribs wrapped so tight it's hard to breathe. And yet, they line up, snap after snap. Because in the 1950s NFL, the phrase "playing through pain wasn't just a badge of honor" was a requirement for survival. There was no injury report back then. No weekly disclosures for the media. No out, questionable, or probable labels that fans now see on their screens. If you were hurt, you stayed quiet. Because if you spoke up, you risked losing your job. Coaches had little patience for players who admitted weakness. Owners had even less. And with rosters small and replacements always waiting for their shot, silence was the safer option. Medical care was primitive by today's standards. Team doctors often worked for the franchise, not the player. Their job was to get a man back on the field, not to protect his long-term health. Painkillers were rudimentary basic pills, heavy doses of aspirin, maybe a cortisone shot if you were lucky. Some players relied on whiskey before games, numbing the body before collisions began. The idea of concussion protocol didn't exist. If you could stand up and remember the playbook, you were sent back in. One lineman from that era once recalled, "You weren't just expected to play hurt, you were expected to never mention it." If you limped, they noticed. If you grimaced, they noticed. If they noticed too often, you were gone. The physical toll was staggering. Fingers became permanently crooked from breaks that were never reset. Knees deteriorated into bone grinding. Shoulders dislocated so many times that some players slept with their arms bound to keep them in place. And still, Sundays came, and still, they played. Part of the reason was cultural. America in the 1950s prized toughness and stoicism. Men returned from war, built families, worked long shifts, and rarely complained. Football mirrored that ethos. A player was expected to be tough, silent, and dependable. Pain was part of manhood, and showing weakness was unthinkable. But part of it was also financial. Salaries were so modest that missing a game meant missing money many families desperately needed. Players didn't have guaranteed contracts. If an owner cut you, your paycheck stopped that day. Insurance protections were almost non-existent. Playing through pain wasn't just about pride, it was about putting food on the table. And so, legends were built on battered bodies. Take Y.A. Tittle, the Hall of Fame quarterback who once played an entire game with a broken rib and a punctured lung. He collapsed in the locker room afterward, but he had finished the game. Or Chuck Bednarik, known as the 60-minute man who played both offense and defense. Bednarik absorbed hits that would sideline modern players for weeks. Yet he kept going, game after game. Fans idolized these men for their grit. But what they didn't see were the nights afterward ice baths that barely touched the pain. Wives helping husbands upstairs, players unable to bend enough to tie their own shoes. The glory was public. The suffering was private. Today, the NFL is almost unrecognizable by comparison. Concussion protocols remove players from the field immediately. Independent neurologists decide if an athlete can return. MRI machines catch tears and fractures early. Surgeries are advanced, with rehab programs designed for safe recovery. Contracts have guarantees, meaning missing games doesn't always mean financial ruin. And pain management has shifted from whiskey and aspirin to targeted treatment, though challenges with opioids have introduced their own dangers. And perhaps, most importantly, the culture has changed. Players today are encouraged to speak up about pain. They can sit out to protect their long-term health. Fans still demand toughness, but awareness of CTE, knee replacements, and post-career struggles has created empathy. A quarterback who misses 2 games with a sprained ankle isn't seen as weak, he is seen as smart, preserving a career that could last over a decade. Contrast that with the 1950s, when careers often lasted fewer than 5 years. The average player retired with little money, worn down joints, and decades of physical suffering ahead. Playing through pain extended your career in the short term but shortened your life in the long term. And yet, there's no denying the admiration for that era's warriors. They played with a rawness that feels almost mythic today. Broken bones, torn muscles, concussed mindstay. Endured it all for the love of the game, their respective teammates, and the hope of one more paycheck. Their suffering, in many ways, paved the way for today's safer, more protected NFL. It raises a question worth asking. Could today's stars handle that world? Could a modern quarterback, protected by rules and protocols, endure a season where defensive linemen could hit him high, low, and late where pain was constant and help was non-existent? It's a debate that sparks barroom arguments across generations. Old-timers claim today's players are pampered. Modern fans argue that today's athletes are bigger, faster, and face collisions at a scale the 1950s never saw. Both are true. But what is undeniable is this. The 1950s demanded a level of stoic suffering that no modern athlete will ever have to experience. And maybe that's a good thing, because while the myth of the Iron Man is inspiring, the reality is heartbreaking. Many of those men spent their retirements in hospitals, wheelchairs, or relying on pain medication just to function. Playing through pain brought glory. Yes, but it also left scars, visible and invisible. The NFL's evolution from that era is not just about bigger stadiums, higher salaries, or better broadcasts. It's about valuing human beings over mythology. It's about realizing that toughness should not mean permanent damage. It's about ensuring that the heroes of Sunday can walk with their children on Monday and live without constant agony when the cheering stops. Looking back, the 1950s model feels brutal, even cruel, but it was real. And it was necessary to expose those flaws so the league could grow. Without the stories of men who sacrificed bodies and futures, there would have been no push for safety, no demand for accountability, no recognition that the game could be both fierce and humane. So when we talk about playing through pain, we must remember both sides: the grit, the glory, the legends it produced, but also the cost, the suffering, and the lessons learned. Because in the end, the men who endured that era didn't just keep football alive. They made it possible for the NFL to become what it is today. And as we move forward in this journey, we will see how every bruise, every broken bone, and every silent injury was not just an individual sacrifice, but part of the larger story of how the NFL transformed itself. A league once built on unchecked pain began to realize the value of protection, fairness, and care. And in that transformation lies the true greatness of the game. Imagine stepping onto a football field in the 1950s. The smell of freshly cut grass mixed with cigarette smoke drifting from the stands. The roar of the crowd, though smaller than today's massive stadiums, still thundered with intensity. The players trotted out, shoulder to shoulder, helmets strapped on, uniforms tight. To the untrained eye, they looked ready for battle. But here, as the truth. Most of them were dressed for war with little more protection than a thin piece of leather and some stitched together, padding that could barely soften a hit. This was the brutal reality of NFL equipment in the 1950s. It was primitive, outdated, and in many cases, outright dangerous. Today's fans marvel at the speed and collisions of modern football, but if you dropped one of today's players back into that era wearing 1950s gear, he might not last a half without serious injury. The helmet tells the story best. Before the 1950s, players wore leather helmets, simple, padded head coverings that provided minimal shock absorption. By the early 50s, the league began transitioning into hard plastic helmets. At first, this seemed like progress. Plastic was stronger than leather. It could take more punishment. But there was a dark side to that innovation. Hardshell helmets didn't absorb impact, they transferred it. Every blow to the head rattled inside like a bell being struck. The sound of plastic cracking against plastic became the soundtrack of the game. It was louder, more violent, and ultimately more damaging to the brain. Face masks were another story. Early in the decade, most helmets had none at all. Players' noses, teeth, and jaws were fully exposed. Broken noses were as common as bruised knees. Missing teeth became badges of honor. Only after repeated injuries did the single-bar face mask appear. A thin strip of metal or plastic that offered token protection. Even then, it was laughably inadequate. A defender's hand could easily slip through. An elbow could still shatter teeth. And countless players learned the hard way that a bar of metal an inch from your face could do as much harm as good. Shoulder pads weren't much better. Compared to the sculpted, lightweight, shock-absorbing pads of today, the 1950s version was clunky and ineffective. They were little more than canvas and felt stuffed with padding, strapped loosely over the shoulders. They absorbed almost no force. When players collided, the pads shifted and slid, leaving the body exposed. Linemen often tied them down with extra straps or tape just to keep them in place. But the padding still did little to soften the crushing force of trench warfare in the line of scrimmage. And then there were the uniforms. Jerseys and pants were made of heavy cotton or wool blends that absorbed sweat and rain like sponges. A wet game left players dragging pounds of soaked fabric on their bodies, slowing them down and making them more vulnerable to hits. Cleats were stiff leather with metal-tipped studs. They provided traction, yes, but they also tore into opponents during pile-ups. Countless players left the field with gouges in their skin, not from a tackle, but from another man's cleats raking across their arms or legs. The result of this inadequate equipment was predictable. Injuries piled up at staggering rates. Broken noses, shattered jaws, concussions, dislocated shoulders, broken ribs, and mangled fingers were part of the job. Trainers did what they could, usually taping it up and sending players back in, but the equipment itself offered no real shield from the violence of the game. The gear was, at best, symbolic armor. And yet, here's the paradox. Players loved it. Not because it protected them, but because it made them feel tough. To wear a helmet with no face mask was to show the world you weren't afraid. To play with flimsy pads was to prove your grit. In an odd way, the lack of protection became part of the NFL's culture of toughness. The worse the equipment, the tougher the men seemed. Of course, that toughness came at a cost. Many of the players who suited up in the 1950s would pay for it decades later. Without modern helmets, head trauma was constant. Players got their bell rung week after week, long before the word concussion was even common. Without face masks, teeth were knocked out, jaws wired shut. Without real padding, ribs cracked, lungs bruised, and shoulders ground down to bone-on-bone arthritis. These men gave their bodies to the game, and the equipment gave almost nothing back in return. Think about it this way. Imagine Tom Brady, Aaron Donald, or Patrick Mahomes playing in 1950s gear. Brady's face exposed, Donald crashing into linemen with flimsy pads. Mahomes scrambling in wool-soaked pants and heavy leather cleats. The game would look unrecognizable. The hits would be just as violent, but the protection would be almost non-existent. That's what made football in the 50s not just a sport, but survival. What's remarkable is that even in this environment, innovation slowly began to emerge. Helmets evolved from pure leather to hard plastic. Face masks, even single bars, were a step toward protecting faces. Shoulder pads gradually added more structure. But the pace of change was painfully slow, and it wasn't driven by safety committees or medical research. It was driven by injuries, by broken bones, and shattered teeth, forcing the league to adapt. In other words, progress came only after damage had already been done. Contrast that with today's NFL. Modern helmets are engineering marvels, tested for shock absorption. Equipped with sensors to study impact, designed with air bladders for a custom fit. Face masks now protect the entire face, not just a strip of it. Shoulder pads are lightweight, breathable, and absorb force like car airbags. Uniforms, wick sweat, stay light in rain, and flex with the body. Cleats are carefully designed for traction without tearing flesh. Every piece of equipment is optimized for performance and safety. But maybe the most important change is philosophical. Today, equipment is expected to protect. In the 1950s, it was never about protection. It was about presentation. It was about looking ready for war. Now, equipment is about keeping men safe so they can keep playing, keep earning, and keep living long after football. That shift in mindset may be the single most important evolution in the game. Looking back, the brutality of 1950s equipment is hard to imagine. It was primitive. It was dangerous. And yet, it built the foundation of the league. Those players, underprotected and overexposed, carried the NFL through its early decades and made it what it is today. They did it without the gear we now take for granted, and their sacrifices forced the sport to evolve. The NFL of today is safer, stronger, and more advanced, precisely because the league learned from that brutal era. Every concussion study, every equipment innovation, every safety standard exists because men once played the game in almost medieval armor. Their pain became the catalyst for progress. As we continue this journey, we'll see how that theme repeats itself again and again. Brutality forced change. Hardship forced innovation. And through that cycle, the NFL transformed from a violent spectacle into the structured, global powerhouse it is now. In the next chapter, we'll look beyond equipment to the strategies and formations of the 1950s, a time when coaches experimented wildly. Defenses attacked brutally, and offenses tried to outwit not just opponents, but the physical dangers of the game itself. Football in the 1950s wasn't just about brute force, it was also about brains. This was the decade when strategy began to take on a new life, when X's and O's started to shape games as much as raw toughness. The NFL was still young, still building its identity, but the seeds of modern football were being planted. Coaches were not yet the media stars they would become in later decades, but their influence on the games, schemes, and strategies was already profound. The most common offensive formation in the early 1950s was the single wing, a holdover from college football. It was built for running, not passing. But as the decade wore on, the T formation became the weapon of choice. The T allowed quarterbacks to line up directly under center, giving them more control and more balance between running and passing plays. This shift didn't just change how offenses functioned, changed the very identity of football. Quarterbacks in this era were not the glamorous figures we know today. They were often rugged leaders, expected to block, run, and throw. The passing game was still developing, and interceptions were common. Quarterbacks weren't measured by passer ratings, but by toughness, by whether they could take a hit and keep the offense moving. Yet, slowly, the passing game grew. Legendary names like Otto Graham of the Cleveland Browns and Norm Van Brocklin of the Los Angeles Rams brought precision and vision to the position. They weren't protected by the rules modern quarterbacks enjoy: no roughing the passer flags for late hits. No defensive holding penalties to open up passing lanes. If you wanted to throw, you had to be fearless, because defenders could hit you hard and receivers could be mauled downfield. Defenses, too, began to evolve. In the 1950s, many teams relied on the 5-2 defense 5 linemen and 2 linebackers. It was designed to stuff the run, which still dominated the game. But creative coaches began tinkering, experimenting with alignments that would one day give birth to the modern 4-3 defense. Tom Landry, a player-turned-coach with the New York Giants, pioneered new defensive philosophies that made stopping the pass a legitimate strategy. One of the most innovative moments came when the Giants, under Landry's defensive mind and Vince Lombardi's offensive genius, created a blueprint for balance. Landry worked on disguising coverages, teaching his players to shift and confuse quarterbacks. Lombardi, meanwhile, emphasized timing, precision, and discipline on offense. Together, they built one of the most feared teams of the decade. Football strategy in the 1950s also reflected the culture of the time. Simplicity was key. There weren't pages upon pages of playbooks. A team might have 20 or 30 plays rehearsed until they were second nature. Repetition was the philosophy. Execution mattered more than creativity. The idea was simple. Do a few things, but do them perfectly. Lombardi himself would later be known for saying, "We run it again until we get it right." That mindset was born in this decade. And yet, while playbooks were simple, the chess match was very real. Coaches had to anticipate the tendencies of opponents without film study because game footage was limited or non-existent. Scouting was done by word of mouth, by sending assistant coaches to watch games in person. Adjustments were made on instinct. A coach had to trust his gut and his players' discipline. Special team strategy was also evolving. Kickers were straight in style, booting the ball with the front of their foot. Long before soccer-style kickers revolutionized the game in the 1960s. Punting was critical, and field position often determined outcomes. A game could turn not on a touchdown, but on a well-placed punt that pinned the opponent deep. The schemes of the 1950s were a reflection of survival. There were no helmet radios, no tablets on the sidelines, no instant replay. Coaches shouted instructions from the bench, sometimes sending in plays with substitute players. Other times, quarterbacks were given freedom to call plays on the field, a tradition that linked back to the very roots of football. But behind these strategies was a new truth emerging. Football was becoming more than just a sport of violence, was becoming a game of intellect, a battlefield where preparation and discipline could outwit brute strength. Fans began to notice. Games weren't just collisions anymore. They were contests of planning, execution, and cunning. The 1958 NFL Championship, often called the greatest game ever played, is the culmination of this strategic evolution. It was a showcase of everything the 1950s had built: the balance of running and passing, the defensive adjustments, the discipline of rehearsed plays, and the quarterback's growing role as field general. That game proved to a national television audience that football wasn't just muscle, it was also mind. For the players, learning schemes in the 1950s was no easy task. Many of them worked off-season jobs, and practice time was precious. They studied playbooks after long days of work, memorizing assignments by repetition. Mistakes were punished harshly in practice, and perfection was demanded. The mental toughness required to master schemes was just as high as the physical toughness required to endure violent practices. It's important to remember that these strategies didn't exist in a vacuum. They were shaped by the conditions of the game itself. Smaller rosters meant players often had to play both offense and defense. Fatigue played a role in strategy. Coaches had to design plays that could be executed even when players were exhausted. That meant simplicity, efficiency, and repetition were the foundations of 1950s football. And yet, from these seemingly simple beginnings, greatness emerged. The precision of Graham, the vision of Van Brocklin, the innovations of Landry and Lombardi, all of it was born from the schemes of this era. The 1950s were not just about violence and survival. They were about planting the seeds of modern football intelligence. Today, when fans marvel at exotic blitz packages, spread offenses, and complex passing trees, they are seeing the descendants of the 1950s. Every no-huddle adjustment, every defensive disguise, every quarterback audibling at the line, it all traces back to the decade when football began to think as much as it hit. So when we look back at the NFL of the 1950s, we cannot see it only as a violent, punishing world. It was also the crucible where schemes were tested, refined, and elevated. It was the place where strategy began to matter as much as strength. And as the NFL moved into the 1960s, those seeds would sprout. The balance between brains and brawn would define the modern era. The league was no longer just about who could hit harder, it was about who could outsmart the other side. That was the genius of the 1950s. A decade of grit and punishment, yes, but also a decade of intellect, invention, and the first glimpse of football as the chess match we know today. Up next, we dive into how the NFL's rising television presence in the 1950s not only amplified the strategies on the field but also transformed how the game was consumed by millions of Americans at home. The 1950s had already transformed football on the field with violent practices, hazing rituals, and evolving strategies shaping the men who played. But just as the league was grappling with its identity inside stadiums, another revolution was happening outside: television. And if the schemes and strategies were the lifeblood of the sport, television became its megaphone, projecting football from small NFC stadiums into living rooms across America. Think about it. Before television, football was a regional sport. Teams were supported mostly by local fans. And unless you lived near a stadium, your connection to the NFL was limited to newspaper box scores or a grainy radio broadcast. Football was popular, yes, but it was a niche compared to baseball, which proudly called itself America's pastime. Baseball had decades of cultural dominance, its stars etched in history, its rhythms slow and familiar. Football was faster, rougher, but it lacked visibility. The NFL was still in the shadows. Then television arrived and everything changed. By the early 1950s, only a fraction of American households owned a TV set. But as the decade unfolded, the flickering black and white screen became a centerpiece of family life. Networks were desperate for live programming that could keep viewers glued to their couches. And sports, especially football, fit the bill perfectly. Unlike movies, which were scripted and predictable, football was raw and unscripted. Every snap carried suspense. Every game could deliver drama. For TV executives, this was gold. But here's the twist. The NFL didn't immediately know how to use television. Some owners feared it would hurt ticket sales, thinking fans would rather stay home than pay to see a game in person. Others embraced the idea, recognizing that TV could introduce millions of people to a sport they'd never watched before. The league was at a crossroads, unsure whether this new invention would save them or sink them. The breakthrough came in 1951, when the Los Angeles Rams faced the Cleveland Browns in the NFL championship game. NBC broadcast the matchup coast to coast, the first nationally televised pro football game in history. For fans who had never set foot inside a stadium, it was like opening a window into a world they'd only read about. Suddenly, small towns in the Midwest and rural homes in the South were experiencing NFL football in real time, and the numbers told the story. Interest in the league began to climb. Teams like the Rams, Giants, and Browns started to gain followings beyond their cities. Television turned franchises into national brands. A boy in Oklahoma could now idolize a player from New York or Los Angeles. Geography no longer limited fandom. But the NFL was still learning how to present its product. In the early days, cameras were static, coverage was awkward, and commentary was uneven. Yet even through the flaws, the drama of the sport cut through. Football's intensity translated on screen better than anyone imagined. The crunch of a tackle, the mud-stained uniforms, the sight of a quarterback launching a desperate throw-it was made for television. And here's where the strategies of the game meshed with the strategies of broadcasting. Coaches in the 1950s were beginning to expand their playbooks, adding more complexity and unpredictability. Passing attacks were becoming bolder. Defenses were growing more specialized. That meant more highlight-worthy plays, more stunning moments that looked electrifying on TV. Football didn't just work on television, it thrived. Then, in 1958, came the game that cemented it all. The NFL championship between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants. Played in Yankee Stadium, broadcast nationwide by NBC, it went into sudden death overtime, the first in league history. Millions of viewers watched Johnny Unitas orchestrate a legendary drive and Alan Amici punch in the winning touchdown. Sports writers later called it the greatest game ever played. But perhaps its most important legacy was not on the field, but on the screen. That game made football a television spectacle. It proved the NFL could capture the nation's imagination in a way no other sport could. From that moment, the league leaned into television as its greatest partner. The NFL began negotiating broadcast rights, forging deals that ensured every fan could watch from home. For the owners, it meant money. For the players, it meant exposure. For the fans, it meant access. And together, it meant the NFL was no longer a side attraction. It was becoming the main event. Culturally, television gave the NFL something priceless: heroes. Viewers didn't just read about stars anymore. They saw them, week after week. They could watch Unitas' calm command under pressure, Jim Brown's unstoppable power, or Frank Gifford's graceful athleticism. Faces became as familiar as names. Football players weren't just athletes, they were television personalities, part of the American family. And it wasn't just men watching. Television made football accessible to entire households. Wives, children, grandparents, they all gathered around the TV on Sunday afternoons. Football became a shared ritual, woven into the rhythm of American weekends. But television also magnified the darker realities of the game. The violence, the bone-crunching hits. The moments when players stayed down on the field, suddenly the whole country could see it. No longer hidden behind stadium walls, the brutality of football was now in full view. Some viewers recoiled, others were enthralled. Either way, television forced America to confront what football really was: beautiful, brutal, and utterly captivating. By the end of the 1950s, one thing was clear: the marriage of football and television was unstoppable. The league had discovered its golden window, a stage that magnified every triumph and every flaw. For the players who once lived in obscurity, it meant fame. For the coaches who once ruled unchecked, it meant accountability. For the league that once feared irrelevance, it meant power. And perhaps most importantly, television gave football a future. It set the stage for massive national audiences, billion-dollar contracts, and the global reach the NFL enjoys today. Without television, the NFL might have remained a regional curiosity, overshadowed by baseball forever. With television, it became America's game. As we move forward in this story, the next chapter reveals the other side of this golden window. Because while television brought glory, it also brought pressure. Players were now under the microscope. Coaches were dissected by critics. Owners had to think about image, not just profit. The spotlight was bright, but it was also unforgiving. And next, we'll dive into that spotlight, to exploring how fame, scrutiny, and the rise of celebrity began reshaping the lives of players and the very culture of the NFL. The 1950s NFL was a league of contradictions. It was brutal, yet beautiful, chaotic, yet organized, growing, yet still clinging to the rough edges of its early years. And at the heart of that contradiction stood one position more vulnerable than any other: the quarterback. Today, quarterbacks are the most protected, celebrated, and highly paid athletes in sports. They're brands unto themselves, commanding attention both on and off the field. But in the 1950s, things could not have been more different. The quarterback's life was not about glamour, it was about survival. Back then, the position demanded poise under pressure, but without the security blanket of rules that kept defenses at bay. There were no roughing the passer flags for late hits. A quarterback who released the ball could still be driven into the dirt, speared in the ribs, or blindsided by an opponent intent on knocking him out of the game. The physical toll was immense, and the margin for error was razor thin. Imagine lining up behind your center knowing that every snap was an invitation for punishment. The offensive line was smaller, less specialized, and far less protective than today's towering units. Defensive linemen often outweighed them, and blitzes were unpredictable, unrefined storms of violence. The quarterback was expected to absorb the punishment, dust himself off, and keep calling plays with a steady hand. And yet, the role was not just physical light, was mental. The quarterback was the strategist, the leader, the extension of the coach on the field. He called his own plays, a task that demanded encyclopedic knowledge of the game. There were no helmet radios feeding in instructions from the sideline. Instead, quarterbacks relied on instinct, memory, and quick decision-making. One wrong call could derail a drive. One brilliant choice could change a game. In many ways, the quarterback of the 1950s was a general marching his troops into battle without maps or reinforcements. He had to adjust in real time to shifting defenses, make split-second reads, and disguise his intentions from seasoned veterans determined to crush him. It was chess at high speed, played while someone tried to break your bones. Some quarterbacks thrived under this pressure. Otto Graham of the Cleveland Browns was the prototype of consistency, guiding his team to championship after championship. He was tough, accurate, and intelligent, embodying the qualities coaches demanded in the era. Norm Van Brocklin of the Rams and Eagles earned the nickname the Dutchman for his fiery competitiveness and rocket arm, leading Los Angeles to high-powered offensive fireworks, before capping his career with a title in Philadelphia. Bobby Lane of the Detroit Lions embodied toughness so completely that teammates swore he could shake off any hit, any injury, and come back snarling. Lane was less a polished passer and more a warrior, who willed his team to win. But their greatness was defined not by protection, but by resilience. Each of them endured punishment that today would result in suspensions or massive fines for defenders. They were battered by late hits, driven into the frozen turf in December games, and often forced to play through concussions that went undiagnosed. Lane once broke his leg, but reportedly told teammates he would finish the game if the coach had let him. That kind of stubborn grit wasn't unusual. It was expected. The quarterback was also burdened with cultural perception. Unlike today, where the position is synonymous with celebrity, quarterbacks of the 1950s were not guaranteed respect. Many were scrutinized more harshly than their teammates, blamed quickly for losses, and rarely showered with praise for victories. The game was still run heavy, and some coaches viewed quarterbacks as facilitators rather than stars. If you couldn't hand off cleanly, take a hit, and command authority in the huddle, you wouldn't last long. And then there was the issue of compensation. Quarterbacks weren't immune to the financial struggles of the era. Their salaries were higher than some positions, but nowhere near the astronomical figures of today. Many worked off-season jobs, just like linemen or linebackers. Imagine a quarterback who led his team in passing one Sunday, working as a salesman or laborer in the summer to pay the bills. That dual life stripped the role of its modern mystique. Quarterbacks were leaders on Sunday, ordinary men on Monday. The psychological toll was immense, carrying the responsibility of orchestrating the offense, enduring relentless punishment, and knowing that one mistake could cost you your career weighed heavily on men who played the position. Some thrived on it, using the pressure as fuel. Others crumbled under the scrutiny. Fans and sports writers weren't always kind. Headlines could be ruthless, and boos from the crowd were a constant reminder that failure was not an option. And yet, for all the hardships, The quarterback position began to evolve in the 1950s into something more significant. Coaches like Paul Brown emphasized the quarterback's role as a thinker and leader, creating structured offensive systems that relied on timing and precision. Brown's quarterbacks, including Otto Graham, became prototypes for the modern field general. They showed that the position was not just about toughness, was about intelligence, composure, and adaptability. This shift was subtle but profound. Quarterbacks were slowly emerging as the centerpiece of the NFL, even if the league hadn't fully embraced it yet. Their ability to rise above punishment, to lead in the face of chaos, began to capture the imagination of fans. Newspapers started writing about quarterbacks as individual stars, not just cogs in the machine. Highlight reels increasingly featured their throws, their grit, their last-minute heroics. The foundation of quarterback worship was being laid, brick by brick, in the bruises and broken bones of the 1950s. Looking back now, staggering to think how unprotected these men were. Today's quarterbacks wear flak jackets, helmets designed with cutting-edge technology, and benefit from rules that discourage defenders from even landing too hard on them. In the 1950s, a quarterback might wear little more than a leather chin strap, thin shoulder pads, and the expectation that pain was part of the job. There was no concussion protocol, no blue tent, no neurologist on the sideline. You either played or you didn't, and if you didn't, your career might be over. Yet without those trials, the modern quarterback might never have become the icon he is today. The legends of the 1950s set a standard of resilience that shaped the mythology of the position. They proved that leadership under fire was possible. They turned chaos into opportunity. They carried the burden not just of calling plays, but of embodying what the sport demanded: toughness, intelligence, and courage. When we celebrate quarterbacks today, when we marvel at their precision, their leadership, their star power, we're also celebrating those who came before. Men who had no protection, little financial security, and endless pressure, but who still carried the game forward. The quarterback's burden of the 1950s was not glory. It was survival. But from survival came greatness. As we move forward, we'll see how this position, once defined by punishment and resilience, began to evolve further in the 1960s and beyond. The quarterback would grow into the league's most visible figure, the one position fans could not ignore. But to understand the pedestal quarterbacks stand on today, we must never forget the beating they endured and the burden they carried in the NFL's most unforgiving decade. In the grand story of the NFL's evolution, certain figures rise above the rest, not just as coaches, but as visionaries, architects, and builders of the game itself. The 1950s were a decade of change, turbulence, and growth. And at the heart of that transformation stood two men who, in many ways, could not have been more different yet. Both left legacies that still shape football today. One was Paul Brown, the cerebral innovator who believed in system, precision, and preparation. The other was Vince Lombardi, the fiery motivator whose very name became synonymous with victory. Together, they embodied two distinct philosophies of leadership, and their impact stretched far beyond the sideline chalk of their era. Paul Brown was, without exaggeration, a revolutionary. Born in Norwalk, Ohio, he carried the quiet demeanor of a teacher, which made sense, since he had once been a high school coach and educator. But when he stepped into the professional ranks, he brought with him a methodical approach that changed football forever. He saw the game not as a chaotic struggle of brute force, but as a science, a puzzle to be solved with preparation and precision. To Brown, success began long before kickoff. He pioneered structured playbooks, ensuring every man on his team knew not only his assignment, but the logic behind it. He was among the first to use classroom-style teaching, complete with chalkboards and film study sessions. In an age when many coaches relied on instinct and fire, Brown treated football like engineering. His innovations were staggering. He introduced face masks to protect players. He implemented the practice of sending in plays with guards, later evolving into the modern system of coordinators relaying calls to quarterbacks. He developed detailed scouting reports, grading opponents not just on physical ability, but on tendencies, habits, and decision-making. Even pioneered the use of the 40-yard dash as a measurable standard for evaluating speed. Something so commonplace now that it's hard to imagine a world without it. Paul Brown's fingerprints can still be found in every NFL facility today. And yet, for all his brilliance, Brown could be cold, distant, and rigid. His players respected him deeply, but many feared him as well. He was a disciplinarian who demanded precision, and he rarely showed emotion. To Brown, football was business, and sentiment had little place in the business of winning. He cut players without hesitation, even if they had given him years of service. He didn't tolerate rebellion, and he didn't compromise on his vision. In a way, his very detachment gave him power. He was less of a coach and more of a general, commanding from a place of authority that no one dared question. Then there was Vince Lombardi. If Paul Brown was the scientist, Lombardi was the preacher. Born to an Italian immigrant family in Brooklyn, New York, Lombardi carried the grit and fire of the city in his veins. His path to coaching was not as direct as Brown's, but once he arrived in the NFL, he became an unstoppable force of will. Where Brown relied on intellect, Lombardi relied on inspiration. He was not interested in overcomplicating the game. To him, football boiled down to fundamentals, discipline, and execution. His philosophy was clear. Football is blocking and tackling. Everything else is mythology. Yet his simplicity was deceptive. Lombardi's teams didn't just block and tackle. They executed with such relentless precision that even when opponents knew what was coming, they couldn't stop it. His famous power sweep became the signature play of his Green Bay Packers, run so effectively that it seemed like an unstoppable law of nature. To Lombardi, repetition built mastery. Practices were grueling, but they forged unity and discipline. And above all, Lombardi's words lit fires in the hearts of his players. He could stand before a room of exhausted men, look them in the eyes, and make them believe they were capable of anything. Where Brown's genius lay in preparation, Lombardi's lay in motivation. He made men want to play not just for themselves, not just for victory, but for him. His speeches carried the weight of Scripture. He invoked sacrifice, faith, and duty. His Catholic background shaped his belief in discipline and order. But his Brooklyn roots gave him a toughness and authenticity that resonated with working-class players. He demanded everything his men had, and in return, he gave everything of himself. The contrast between Brown and Lombardi reflected two paths of leadership, two ways of commanding loyalty and respect. Brown's teams thrived on structure. Lombardi's thrived on spirit. Brown demanded perfection through system. Lombardi demanded perfection through effort. Both were harsh in their own ways. Brown's coldness could leave players feeling expendable. Lombardi's intensity could break men who lacked resilience. Yet, both produced champions. Both created dynasties, and both redefined what it meant to lead in professional football. It is impossible to overstate their influence. Paul Brown's Cleveland Browns became a model franchise, dominating both the AAFC and the early NFL. His methods spread across the league as other coaches copied his innovations. The idea of organized preparation, scouting, and systematic teaching changed the profession forever. Meanwhile, Vince Lombardi's Packers became the symbol of excellence in the 1960s, winning 5 championships in 7 years, including the first 2 Super Bowls. His name now graces the very trophy awarded to every Super Bowl champion. But beyond wins and trophies, the legacies of these men carried something deeper. They shaped the culture of football. Brown made the NFL more professional, more structured, more disciplined as an organization. Lombardi gave the sport its soul, its language of sacrifice, determination, and glory. Even today, when coaches give speeches about effort, when players talk about preparation, when fans marvel at strategy. They are unknowingly echoing the philosophies of these two titans. Of course, neither man was perfect. Brown's rigidity eventually led to clashes with ownership, culminating in his firing from the team that bore his name, a bitter end that revealed his human flaws. Lombardi, for all his greatness, drove himself with such intensity that it eventually consumed his health, leading to his untimely death at the age of 57. But in their flaws, too, they reflected the cost of greatness, the toll that leadership can take on the leader himself. The 1950s NFL was brutal, unregulated, and evolving. In that crucible, Paul Brown and Vince Lombardi rose not just as coaches, but as legends. Their methods were different, their temperaments contrasting, yet together they built the foundation of modern football. One gave the game its structure, the other gave it its spirit. And in the end, both prove that leadership, in whatever form it takes, is what turns raw talent into enduring greatness. As we leave behind the coaching giants, the story of the NFL's evolution now shifts back to the men who carried out their visions, the players themselves. Because behind every genius on the sidelines stood men who risked everything on the field, and sometimes their very futures. In the next segment, we will step back onto the gridiron to explore the life of the 1950s player, their struggles, their sacrifices, and their fight for respect in a league still finding its way. Imagine waking up in a small rented apartment in a city where football is loved but not yet worshipped. The alarm clock rattles at 6 a.m., not because practice starts early, but because you have a second job to get to before you put on your shoulder pads. This was the reality for many professional football players in the 1950s. Playing in the National Football League was not a ticket to financial security. It was a passion, a grind, and often a gamble with both health and livelihood. To truly understand this era, you have to step into the shoes of the men who lived it hour by hour, task by task. A player's morning might begin in a factory, an office, or even on a construction site. The NFL paid modestly. Salaries averaged between $5,000 and $7,000 a year, hardly enough to support a family in most cities. Many players supplemented that income with off-season jobs that sometimes bled into training camp or even the season itself. Imagine hammering nails on a half-finished home development in the morning, then sprinting onto a muddy practice field in the afternoon, carrying both exhaustion and obligation on your back. By mid-morning, players who didn't have work obligations might find themselves in a cramped team meeting room. No plush training facilities, no massive stadium complexes with gyms and lounges. Meetings were often held in rented hotel ballrooms or makeshift spaces within old stadiums. Chalkboards were the central technology. Coaches would scribble X's and O's, explaining plays and protections, their voices echoing in poorly lit rooms that smelled of sweat and stale coffee. A player had to memorize quickly because handouts were scarce and film sessions were rare compared to today. You learned by listening, watching, and doing. Then came practice. If the weather was brutal, that didn't matter. Helmets were leather or early plastic shells with little padding. Shoulder pads were stiff and heavy, offering less protection than a modern youth set. Jerseys were wool or thick cotton, clinging to sweat and mud. There was no bottled water waiting on the sideline, no sports drinks, no nutrition staff monitoring hydration. Players filled battered metal coolers with water, and, if you were lucky, a towel was passed around to wipe off your face. The drills were punishing. Coaches in the 1950s believed toughness was forged through repetition and pain. A lineman might hit a blocking sled over and over until his shoulders burned. Then line up again for contact drills against teammates. Scrimmages were frequent, and contact was relentless. Concussions were not tracked. Getting your bell rung was treated as a badge of honor, not a medical emergency. If a player wobbled after a hit, he was often encouraged to shake it off and get back in the huddle. By the time practice ended, players were physically drained, but their day was far from over. Some had second shifts at jobs to return to. Others simply collapsed into the locker room, rubbing sore muscles with little more than hot showers and tape as recovery tools. Training staff was minimal, often just 1 or 2 men responsible for taping ankles and offering salt tablets. Ice baths were rudimentary at best, sometimes just tubs filled with cold water. Meals were an afterthought compared to today's carefully calculated nutrition plans. A player might grab a sandwich from a diner, eat meatloaf at home with his family, or down a few beers with teammates after practice. There was no protein shake waiting after a workout, no individualized diet plan, no team chefs. Food was about filling the stomach, not fueling the body. And yet, even after such long days, football remained central. Many players would spend evenings reviewing handwritten notes from meetings or flipping through playbooks that were more like pamphlets compared to today's thick binders. Family life suffered. Wives managed households, often without much financial stability, while players juggled the dual pressures of work and sport. Children sometimes saw their fathers exhausted, limping, or nursing bruises after games. Injuries were carried silently, knees that throbbed, fingers bent permanently out of place, backs that tightened every morning. Weekends meant game day, and here the reality shifted into sharp focus. Players traveled on cramped buses or commercial flights. Pre-game meals were basic: steak, eggs, or spaghetti, whatever the coaches thought would provide energy. Locker rooms were far from glamorous. Wooden benches, shared showers, and a trainer's table tucked in a corner. No music blaring, no cameras capturing pre-game rituals. Just the quiet sound of men taping wrists, tying laces, and pulling on equipment that never quite fit right. The games themselves were brutal. The 1950s NFL was slower in pace compared to modern standards, but it was harder in contact. Offensive lines smashed into defenses with little concern for long-term damage. Quarterbacks were barely protected by rules. Late hits, high tackles, and crushing blows were routine. Players played both ways, fence and defense, doubling the physical toll. A running back might take 20 hits on offense and then turn around to tackle on defense. Substitutions were limited. Fatigue was guaranteed. And through it all, fans filled the stands not for spectacle, but for community. Stadiums were smaller, crowds rowdier, and tickets cheaper. Players felt connected to the fans because, in truth, they weren't so different. Both worked jobs, both scraped to get by. The NFL player of the 1950s was not a millionaire celebrity, but a working-class athlete representing his city with pride. After the game, there were no post-game recovery rooms or luxurious flights home. Players iced swollen joints in buckets, dressed in suits or simple clothes, and headed back to family or second jobs. Medical care, if needed, was basic. Team doctors often pushed for quick fixes, painkillers, cortisone shots, or crude surgeries that ended careers as often as they saved them. The risks were enormous, but players accepted them because football was both a dream and, for many, their only real shot at recognition. What emerges from this portrait is not just the image of a football player, but of a man caught between passion and survival. These athletes were not cushioned by wealth or surrounded by endless support systems. They were ordinary men performing extraordinary feats in extraordinary pain. Their daily lives were filled with sacrifice of body, of family time, of financial comfort, and yet they kept going. Because football, even in its roughest form, offered something else: dignity. To wear a uniform in the NFL was to carry pride. It meant that despite the bruises, despite the low pay, despite the lack of safety nets, you were part of something bigger than yourself. And that pride made the grind bearable. Looking back now, the daily reality of a 1950s NFL player feels worlds away from the modern game. Today's stars have personal trainers, million-dollar contracts, and endless resources. But it is worth remembering that the NFL of today rests on the backs of those who woke up early, worked long hours, played through pain, and went to bed with sore bodies only to do it again the next day. They built the league not with comfort, but with resilience. Their stories, quiet, unglamorous, and intimate, remind us that greatness is not always born in luxury. Sometimes it is forged in the ordinary grind of extraordinary men. Imagine standing on the sideline of a 1950s NFL field. The air is cold, your uniform thin, and your body already sore from a week's worth of violent practices. You look around at the men next to you, teammates who work second jobs, who carry nagging injuries that never heal, who tape their ankles so tightly it cuts circulation just to stay upright. You all share an unspoken truth. This won't last long. No one in that era truly believed professional football was a lifetime career. It was a chapter, sometimes a short, brutal one. In the 1950s, NFL careers were shockingly brief. The average player might last 3 or 4 years, if that. The brutal nature of the game, combined with poor medical treatment and the absence of modern protections, meant bodies wore down fast. A bad knee injury could end everything overnight. A concussion wasn't treated as a medical crisis, but as getting your bell rung. Players returned to the field after injuries that, today, would keep a man out for months or end a season. There was no concept of load management, no sports science designed to extend careers, no union pushing for protections. A coach could drive his roster through grueling double practices every day of the week, and no one would object. For many players, it wasn't a question of if their careers would end suddenly, but when. Some careers ended quietly. A man would be cut after showing he was no longer the same following an injury. He'd limp away, with little fanfare, back to his hometown or into a factory job. Others ended dramatically, with brutal hits that left players unconscious, unable to return. Either way, the league kept moving. The team filled the roster spot, and the game went on. This was perhaps the greatest shadow over the dream of playing in the NFL during the 1950s, the lack of longevity. Young men would dedicate their lives to reaching the league, only to find themselves out of it before they turned 30. Some left with scars and stories, others with permanent injuries. Very few walked away completely unscathed. To understand this reality, you have to picture what medical care looked like. Sideline doctors were often little more than local physicians, sometimes even just trainers without formal medical credentials. X-rays existed, but advanced imaging like Mr.'s did not. Cartilage tears were career-ending because surgical techniques hadn't advanced enough to repair them reliably. A player with a blown knee in 1955 faced 2 options: retire or play through pain until the leg gave out completely. Concussions, now a central conversation in the modern NFL, were almost completely ignored. A player who took a vicious hit might be knocked unconscious, helped to the bench, and then told to shake it off by the next series. There was no protocol, no medical tent, no neurologist on standby. Some players never recovered fully, living with headaches, dizziness, or memory loss for the rest of their lives. Others would suffer cumulative trauma that wasn't fully understood until decades later. The result was a revolving door of talent. Teams cycled through rosters constantly, with new rookies arriving every year to replace the fallen. For the league, this created a sense of rugged, relentless competition. For players, it meant their job security was paper thin. One injury, one slow season, and their place was gone. And this short window of opportunity shaped how players approached the game. They knew they had to squeeze every drop of value out of their brief time in the NFL. That's why so many played recklessly, throwing themselves into collisions, ignoring pain, and refusing to admit when something felt wrong. They believed, often correctly, that if they didn't play through injuries, someone else would take their spot. At the same time, they also knew they had to plan for life beyond football. That's why so many players of the 1950s held off-season jobs or even worked part-time during the season. They understood that their careers could end at any moment, and they couldn't rely on football alone to sustain them. This reality created a culture of humility and practicality. NFL stars of the 1950s might be recognized in their hometowns, but they weren't celebrities on the scale of baseball players or boxers. They were workers' temporary gladiators who knew their time in the arena was fleeting. And yet, within this unforgiving system, greatness emerged. Men like Otto Graham, Norm Van Brocklin, and Gino Marchetti defied the odds, lasting longer than most and building reputations that carried them into football immortality. Their longevity was seen as almost superhuman in that era, a testament not just to talent but to resilience, toughness, and maybe a bit of luck. Every season they survived added to their legend. But for every star who endured, there were dozens of forgotten players whose careers flickered briefly before disappearing. These were the linemen who played 2 seasons before a back injury ended their run, the defensive backs who never returned after a broken leg, the rookies who never made it past training camp because of the league's unrelenting physical demands. This churn of players gave the NFL a particular flavor in the 1950s. It was a league of constant renewal, with fresh faces coming and going, but only a handful achieving stability. Fans might remember a star for a few seasons, but entire rosters turned over quickly. It was a reminder that professional football, at that time, was less of a stable profession and more of a gamble, a dangerous pursuit with uncertain rewards. And this instability shaped the culture of toughness that defined the league. Players embraced the mentality of warriors fighting not just opponents, but time itself. They weren't only trying to win games, they were trying to prolong careers, to keep themselves relevant for another season, another paycheck. That urgency gave the NFL of the 1950s a raw edge, an intensity that made it captivating for fans, but punishing for those inside it. Looking back today, it's almost unthinkable how fragile those careers were. The average NFL player now has the benefit of advanced medical care, strict injury protocols, and a union fighting for his longevity. Careers are still short compared to other professions, but they are far longer and safer than in the 1950s. Modern stars can plan for a decade in the league if they stay healthy. And even role players can carve out respectable tenures. The difference is staggering. But the brevity of 1950s careers also left a legacy. It forced players to play with desperation, creating unforgettable moments of courage, sacrifice, and grit. It made stars shine brighter because fans knew their time might be short. And it set the stage for the eventual rise of the Players' Union, as generations of athletes demanded more stability and protection. The 1950s were the decade of fleeting careers of heroes who burned brightly and then faded quickly, leaving only memories behind. It was a harsh reality, but it gave the league its character. Football was not yet a career. It was a test, a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down to young men willing to risk everything for a shot at glory. And that is what made it both beautiful and tragic. The brevity of those careers gave them intensity. The risks made the rewards sweeter. And though many players left broken or forgotten, their sacrifices laid the foundation for the league we know today. As we move forward, the story of longevity or the lack of it leads us naturally into another crucial theme: how the NFL began to adapt. In the coming years, innovations in equipment, coaching, and medical care would slowly start to extend careers. But in the 1950s, the message was clear. Play hard, play fast, and prepare for the end. Because in that era, the end was always closer than you thought. In the story of the NFL, some of the most profound transformations didn't come from the playbook or the rulebook. They came from the very fabric of what players wore onto the field, the armor that separated flesh and bone from the violent collisions of the gridiron. The late 1950s marked the beginning of a quiet revolution in football equipment. It's a transition that signaled the end of leather and canvas and the dawn of plastic, padding, and protection that would shape the modern athlete. Imagine a player stepping into the locker room in 1955. Hanging on a nail in front of him is a uniform that feels more like workwear than sports gear. His jersey is heavy cotton, designed not for speed, but for durability. His pants are thick canvas with barely their thigh pads stitched in, stiff and unforgiving. His helmet tift, he's lucky, has a single-bar face mask bolted on. Just a decade earlier, many players still wore leather helmets. That looked more like aviator caps than protective gear. By the mid to late 50s, plastic shells were becoming the norm, but their effectiveness was still questionable. The introduction of the plastic helmet in the 1940s had been controversial. Some coaches swore they made the game more dangerous. The reasoning was simple. Players now felt protected enough to use their heads as weapons. A leather helmet stung when you led with your skull. A plastic shell made it feel like you were invincible, at least for a moment. But the mid-1950s saw refinements, better materials, stronger shells, and the slow acceptance of face masks, which began to spread across the league. After Cleveland Browns legend Otto Graham suffered a brutal injury that nearly ended his career. When Graham returned with a protective mask, it looked strange at first, but it was the start of a shift no one could reverse. Still, for players of the 1950s, protection was relative. The shoulder pads of the era were bulky but primitive, often little more than layers of felt, leather, and plastic riveted together. They were designed to cover the shoulders and upper chest, but they offered minimal flexibility. Players often cut pieces away themselves, trying to find a balance between protection and mobility. A linebacker who wanted to hit harder might sacrifice some padding for range of motion. A quarterback might strip down the bulk to free his throwing arm. There was no standardization, no safety board approving designs, just trial, error, and survival. Uniforms, too, were evolving. The wool and cotton jerseys of the early NFL, which absorbed sweat and grew heavier as the game went on, were slowly being replaced by lighter blends. Colors became brighter, logos bolder. The league was beginning to understand the power of television, and uniforms had to look sharp under the lights. But aesthetics didn't change the fact that players walked onto the field with padding that would horrify today's professionals. The late 50s also introduced innovations like rib protectors and improved hip padding. Many of these were developed at the college level and trickled up to the pros. Trainers, equipment managers, and even players themselves would jury-rig new designs, wrapping foam around ribs, sewing extra padding into pants, or experimenting with reinforced shoes. Football cleats, in particular, were transitioning from flat-soled boots to designs that resembled track shoes with screw-in studs, giving players better traction but also increasing the violence of hits, as defenders could now plant and drive with terrifying force. This period of experimentation came at a cost. With no governing oversight, new equipment was tested on the field in real time, often with disastrous consequences. A faulty chin strap, a cracked helmet, or padding that shifted mid-game could expose a player to serious injury. And because the science of concussions was virtually non-existent, helmets were seen primarily as a way to prevent skull fractures, not brain trauma. Players often boasted about the rattle they felt after a big hit, unaware of the long-term damage being done. But the late 50s represented momentum. A shift in thinking was underway. Owners and coaches began to realize that better equipment meant longer careers, and longer careers meant star power. Fans could rally around players who weren't constantly sidelined or retiring early due to injuries. Manufacturers saw opportunity, too. Companies like Riddle and Wilson started investing in research and marketing their gear as cutting edge, planting the seeds of the billion-dollar sports equipment industry that would explode decades later. The evolution of uniforms and gear also mirrored the evolution of the league itself. As the NFL fought for legitimacy against rival leagues and sought to attract national audiences, player safety and presentation became part of the pitch. A player in a gleaming helmet with a bold logo on the side looked like a warrior of the television age, not a relic of the leather helmet era. The game was becoming faster, more violent, and more professional. Equipment had to keep pace. Yet for the men who lived it, the changes of the late 1950s were uneven. Some stars had access to the best innovations, while rookies or journeymen made do with hand-me-downs. A veteran might cling to his old helmet because it felt familiar, even if it offered less protection. An equipment manager might cut corners to save money, handing out outdated pads to half the roster. Safety was not yet standardized, was improvised. Still, something undeniable was happening. The image of the NFL player was shifting. No longer a muddy, anonymous figure in leather gear, he was beginning to look like a modern athlete, armored, sleek, and television-ready. The seeds of today's high-tech equipment, from air bladder helmets to lightweight Kevlar pads, were being planted in those late 1950s experiments. And behind it all was the reality that football was pushing human bodies to their limits. Every improvement in protection allowed for a new level of speed, a harder collision, a fiercer contest. In that sense, the evolution of equipment was not just about safety, was about enabling the next stage of the game itself. As the decade drew to a close, players began to feel the difference. A rookie stepping into the league in 1959 found a game that looked and felt different than it had in 1950. He wore a plastic helmet with a face mask, lighter pads, sharper cleats, and a brighter uniform. He still faced danger every snap, but for the first time, he could sense that the game was changing in his favor. However, slightly. That was the birth of better armor. And in many ways, it was the NFL acknowledging something it had long resisted, that players were not disposable. Their safety, their longevity, and their image mattered not only to themselves, but to the survival and growth of the league. The evolution of equipment in the late 1950s wasn't just about what players wore. It was about the NFL beginning to shed its past and embrace its future. From leather to plastic, from cloth to blends, from anonymity to identity, the shift was happening. And it would set the stage for the radical transformations of the 1960s. Next, we'll step into that next era where equipment became not just about protection, but about performance, branding, and identity. The helmets started carrying more than just a logo. They became symbols of cities, of pride, of belonging. The NFL was about to enter a new chapter, one where the armor itself became part of the spectacle. The late 1950s and early 1960s represented a quiet but powerful turning point in professional football, a period when the sport began to grapple with the question of whether it could be both thrilling and safe. Up to this point in our journey, we've seen how players endured brutal practices, unsafe conditions, and equipment that offered little more than the illusion of protection. But by the dawn of the 1960s, whispers of change had started to ripple through the league. Those whispers would eventually transform into a movement that forced coaches, owners, and league officials to confront a reality. If football was to grow into the national obsession it would become, it had to evolve beyond sheer toughness. It had to begin protecting its players. This was not an overnight revolution. In fact, for many veterans of the game, the very idea of safety reforms seemed laughable. The culture of football in the 1950s had glorified pain, endurance, and the myth of indestructibility. Coaches prided themselves on pushing men to their physical and mental limits, and players took pride in proving they could withstand the punishment. To suggest that padding needed to be improved, or that helmets should be made more protective, sounded to some like a weakening of the sport's very soul. Yet beneath this cultural resistance, undeniable signs of danger kept mounting. Head injuries, in particular, were impossible to ignore. Doctors began publishing early reports in medical journals linking repeated head trauma with long-term cognitive issues. Although the phrase chronic traumatic encephalopathy had not yet been coined, players who retired after only a handful of seasons often showed troubling signs, memory lapses, mood swings, and sudden declines in their physical coordination. At the time, these symptoms were written off as the price of playing a violent game. But for those within the league who were paying attention, the pattern was too consistent to be ignored. Helmets became the focal point of debate. By the mid-1950s, most players had switched from leather helmets to hard plastic shells, which had been introduced a decade earlier. On the surface, this seemed like a significant step forward. The plastic offered sturdier protection against cuts and fractures, and it gave players confidence to use their heads more aggressively in collisions. But that very confidence created a new problem. The helmet itself became a weapon. Players were leading with their heads, launching themselves into opponents in ways that leather-era players would never have dared. The result was more concussions, not fewer. Coaches praised the hard hits, but the consequences were beginning to pile up. Meanwhile, padding was still relatively primitive. Shoulder pads were thin, often made of fiberboard with minimal cushioning. Hip and thigh pads were inconsistent, with some players even removing them because they felt the pads slowed them down. Uniforms were tight-fitting, designed for mobility rather than impact absorption. Protective technology had not yet caught up with the speed and power of the modernizing game. The athletes of the 1960s were bigger, faster, and stronger than their predecessors. But their equipment had barely changed since the Second World War. The mismatch was becoming dangerous. It was within this atmosphere that quiet reformers began to emerge. Some were medical professionals working behind the scenes, urging teams to adopt stricter return-to-play protocols for injured players. Others were equipment innovators, tinkering with new materials and designs. Riddle, already a leading helmet manufacturer, began experimenting with internal suspension systems, webbing, and padding designed to absorb shock rather than transfer it directly to the skull. Early versions of the face mask, first resisted as unmanly, became widely adopted by the late 1950s, reducing the number of facial injuries and broken jaws. These small steps may not have solved football's larger safety crisis, but they marked the beginning of a shift, an acknowledgement that the game had to evolve if it was to survive. The players themselves, however, were caught in a difficult position. On the one hand, they wanted better protection. Few men enjoyed ending a game bloodied or concussed. On the other hand, they feared that advocating for safety would be seen as weakness. In the 1950s culture of football, toughness was currency. To admit concern about injuries was to risk being labeled soft, or worse, expendable. Most players remained silent, quietly thankful when new equipment arrived, but unwilling to openly campaign for reform. The union, still in its infancy, had not yet gained the power to demand sweeping changes. What truly forced the league's hand was not player protest, but public perception. As football gained more visibility thanks to television broadcasts, rising attendance, and the growing popularity of the NFL championship game, fans began witnessing the brutality more clearly than ever before. When a player collapsed on the field from a head injury, or when a broken bone was shown being tended to on the sideline, millions of viewers saw it unfold in real time. The violence was part of the appeal, but it also sparked concern. Parents began questioning whether they should let their children play the game. Columnists wrote about the dangers of excess brutality. The NFL realized that its future marketability depended on showing it was doing anything to keep its players safe. By the turn of the 1960s, the league began taking incremental steps. Rules were slowly adjusted to penalize the most dangerous hits, such as spearing with the helmet. Medical staff were given slightly more authority, though coaches still dominated decisions. Equipment regulations became more standardized, ensuring that players wore basic padding. It was not a revolution, but it was the beginning of one. These early reforms planted the seeds for the sweeping safety overhauls that would come decades later. Looking back now, it is easy to see how modest these changes were compared to what would eventually be required. But in their time, they represented a profound cultural shift. For the first time, the NFL was acknowledging that toughness alone could not carry the game forward. The sport had to balance spectacle with responsibility, aggression with protection. The groundwork was being laid for an NFL that would one day prioritize concussion protocols, high-tech equipment, and player health initiatives. And yet, as much as the league was inching toward reform, the players of the late 1950s and early 1960s still lived daily with enormous risk. Every collision carried the possibility of permanent damage. Every practice session could end in a career-ending injury. Their world was still far closer to gladiatorial combat than to the structured, safety-conscious NFL of today. The reforms of the era may have been historic, but they were not enough to save many men from shortened careers and lifelong pain. This dual reality, the promise of progress and the persistence of danger, defined the NFL as it entered the 1960s. The game was evolving, but it remained unforgiving. Safety reforms had begun, but the road ahead was long, and for many players, it would come too late. As we move forward in this story, I will examine how the rising visibility of the NFL in the 1960s through television, marketing, and cultural expansion wrought the game's violence into living rooms across America. The league had to balance its identity. Could football remain the toughest sport in the world while also becoming the most popular? That tension would shape the next phase of the NFL's growth. The 1950s NFL was not just about football. It was about the collision between a sport still finding its identity and a country redefining itself after war, prosperity, and cultural upheaval. To understand the league, you have to understand the America it was growing inside of. And the story of that clash reveals why the game became so much more than a pastime. Post-war America was booming. The war had ended, the economy was roaring, and suburbia was exploding. The image of the American dream was everywhere. The tidy house, the shiny car in the driveway, the stay-at-home mother, the father returning from a stable job. But beneath that glossy exterior were tensions, racial, economic, and generational, that made the 1950s a restless decade. Football, with its violence, spectacle, and rising popularity, became both a reflection and an escape. Baseball was still considered the national pastime, but football was steadily muscling its way into the cultural conversation. Why? Because football felt like America. It was about grit, teamwork, and strategy. It mirrored the military values of discipline and order that were fresh in people's minds. After World War II and the Korean War, it spoke to a generation of men who had marched, saluted, and sacrificed overseas, then returned home looking for something to channel their intensity into. On Sunday afternoons, they found it on the gridiron. But the NFL of the 1950s didn't just mirror the good side of America. It also carried its struggles. Take race, for example. The 1950s were the decade of Brown v. Board of Education, of the first stirrings of the civil rights movement. Yet the NFL was slow to embrace integration. Teams quietly limited the number of black players on rosters. Certain positions, quarterback, middle linebacker, were unofficially reserved for white players because of outdated stereotypes about intelligence and leadership. Just as America was grappling with segregation, so too was the league. For the players, this meant daily contradictions. A black player might share a locker room and a huddle with white teammates, but when the team traveled to the South, he could be denied a hotel room or a seat at a restaurant. The team often made arrangements, separating players of color from the rest. Some men endured it quietly, while others began to push back. Their courage helped lay the groundwork for a more integrated future, both in football and in the country. Beyond race, the cultural clash also appeared in gender roles. Football was a masculine world, built on toughness and sacrifice. The 1950s culture of masculinity prized stoicism. Men weren't supposed to show weakness or pain. On the field, that translated into playing through injuries, hiding concussions, and never admitting fear. Coaches hammered at home. Toughness was everything. For players, this wasn't just about the game, which is about being a man in 1950s America. And that expectation shaped the way they lived their entire lives. At the same time, television was quietly reshaping the NFL's relationship with American families. In a decade where families gathered around the TV every night, football was one of the few programs that could bring fathers, mothers, and children together. Networks realized that football's stop-and-start rhythm fit television perfectly. Natural breaks for commercials, suspenseful build-ups, and moments of sudden violence that riveted viewers. Suddenly, the NFL was not just a game, was a broadcast event, piped directly into the living room. Television also changed how players were perceived. In earlier decades, most fans only knew players from grainy newspaper photos or radio broadcasts. But in the 1950s, fans could see the sweat, the blood, the expressions of exhaustion. The sport became personal in a way it never had before. Heroes were born not just from statistics, but from images. A quarterback's grimace, a lineman's mud-streaked face, a running back collapsing across the goal line. But the culture clash ran deeper. In many ways, football symbolized the tension between conformity and rebellion that defined the 1950s. America encouraged sameness rows of houses, identical neighborhoods, rigid social norms. Football, too, was about conformity. 11 men working as one, each assigned a role, each expected to execute without deviation. Yet within that conformity was room for rebellion, flashes of improvisation from a running back breaking free, or a quarterback defying the playbook to improvise a miracle. Fans loved those moments because they reflected a hidden truth. Even in an age of conformity, Americans longed for individuality. The Cold War added another layer. In a decade obsessed with strength, discipline, and vigilance, football became a metaphor for national readiness. Coaches often used military language: battles, trenches, blitzes. To fans who lived under the constant threat of nuclear war, football's violence felt both familiar and cathartic. It gave shape to their anxieties, a way to watch conflicts play out on a field instead of a battlefield. And yet, for all its alignment with the era, football also stood apart from mainstream American life. It was brutal in a way that clashed with the image of polished suburban serenity. The gridiron was muddy, bloody, and rough, far removed from the manicured lawns and gleaming appliances that symbolized 1950s progress. Perhaps that was part of its appeal. It allowed fans to experience chaos and violence in a safe, contained arena. It reminded them that beneath the neat exterior of post-war America, life was still unpredictable. This cultural clash shaped the way the league grew. Owners marketed football as both wholesome entertainment and hard-hitting spectacle. They leaned into patriotic imagery, connecting the game to military values, while also selling it as family-friendly. It was a delicate balance. The NFL needed to be tough enough to thrill men, but respectable enough that mothers would let their children watch. This dual identity, part war, part family outing, helped cement football as America's sport. For the players, however, the clash was personal. They lived at the intersection of celebrity and anonymity, of brutality and glory. On Sundays, they were cheered as warriors. On Mondays, they went back to their modest jobs or worried about paying the bills. Some were recognized in diners, but most blended back into ordinary life. This duality, hero and everyman, was uniquely 1950s, in a culture that valued both conformity and heroism. The NFL player embodied both. Looking back, the NFL of the 1950s cannot be separated from the America of the 1950s. The two grew together, shaped each other, and reflected each other's contradictions. Football was America's mirror, showing its strengths, exposing its flaws, and giving its people something to rally around in a decade defined by both prosperity and unease. And as the sport grew, the clash only intensified. The NFL would soon face bigger questions. Could it fully embrace integration? Could it handle the growing power of television? Could it balance its violent essence with its new family-friendly image? Those questions would define the league in the years to come. The 1950s NFL was not just a sport. It was America in miniature, its struggles, its triumphs, its contradictions. And it was preparing to explode into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. As we move forward, we will take us deeper into one of those defining questions: the rise of television as the NFL's most powerful partner, and how the screen transformed not just the way people watched the game, but the way the game was played. When we think of the NFL today, we think of screens, TVs glowing in living rooms, bars packed with fans staring at giant flat panels. Mobile phones streaming Sunday highlights and networks paying billions for the rights to broadcast games. But there was a time, not so long ago, when football was not built for television at all. In the 1950s, the marriage of football and TV was just beginning. And like any new relationship, it was awkward, experimental, and full of trial and error. Yet this period would prove to be one of the most important turning points in NFL history, because the game found its audience not just in the stadiums, but in homes across America. To understand the power of television in reshaping the NFL, you have to start by picturing the post-war United States. By 1950, only about 9% of American households had a TV set. Most entertainment still came through radios, newspapers, or trips to the movies. But the decade would witness one of the fastest adoptions of technology in history. By 1959, nearly 90% of households owned a television. The living room became the central gathering place, and the TV became the new hearth around which families spent their evenings. The NFL, sensing this tidal wave, positioned itself to ride it. At first, however, football seemed like an unlikely TV product. Baseball was America's pastime, and its slow pace made it easy to cover. Radio announcers had already perfected the art of storytelling pitch by pitch. Football, by contrast, was chaotic. 11 men crashed into 11 others. The plays unfolded in seconds, the strategies complex and hidden behind formations. Cameras were limited, often just one or two set up on high platforms. The grainy black and white images struggled to capture the speed, violence, and subtlety of the game. Many wondered whether football could ever work as a television spectacle. But necessity breeds innovation. Networks and league officials began experimenting. Announcers developed new ways to explain formations and strategies to viewers at home. Camera operators learned to follow the ball more smoothly, to anticipate rather than react. Instant replay had not yet been invented, so every shot mattered. Mistakes were glaring, but every success hinted at the potential. For the first time, fans who lived hundreds of miles from an NFL stadium could see the action with their own eyes. The game was no longer bound by geography. Perhaps the most pivotal moment came in 1958, with what has since been called the greatest game ever played, the NFL championship between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants. Broadcast nationwide on NBC, it drew a massive audience of over 45 million viewers. At a time when the entire U.S. population was only about 175 million. It wasn't just a football game. It was a national event. Families gathered around their televisions, and for many, it was their first real exposure to professional football. The sudden death overtime thriller, with Johnny Unitas orchestrating a legendary drive, gave television executives and league officials their answer. Football wasn't just suited for TV, it was perfect for it. Why? Because football's structure aligned beautifully with television's needs. The game had built-in breaks, the huddles, the timeouts, the change of possession. These pauses allowed for commentary, analysis, and most importantly for the networks, commercials. Baseball had natural lulls, but football offered clean, predictable windows for advertising. The sport fit television's business model like a glove, and the NFL quickly realized the commercial potential. The late 1950s saw the league experimenting further. Teams began signing local broadcast deals, though this often created conflicts with attendance. Owners feared that televising home games would keep fans from buying tickets. The NFL's solution was the infamous blackout rule. Local broadcasts were banned in a team's home market, ensuring that fans still had to attend in person if they wanted to see their team play live. It was a compromise. But it underscored how carefully the league balanced short-term ticket revenue with the long-term promise of television exposure. Television didn't just change the economics of the game, it began to reshape its very presentation. Uniforms grew sharper, numbers on jerseys became bolder, easier for the cameras to pick up. Field markings were repainted with thicker lines. Even stadium lighting was improved, since night games and televised broadcasts demanded brighter, clearer visuals. Coaches and players had to adjust to, because suddenly millions could watch their mistakes and triumphs. An error on the field was no longer witnessed only by the fans in attendance. It was preserved on tape, replayed, and discussed by sports writers nationwide. The accountability and pressure mounted. Another key change came in the storytelling of the game. Television gave football personalities. Fans could now see the chiseled jaw of a quarterback, the ferocity in the eyes of a linebacker, the exhaustion on a lineman's face after a brutal drive. Radio had given voices, but television gave faces. This humanized the players, transforming them from faceless warriors into household names. Men like Unitas, Frank Gifford, and Sam Huff weren't just athletes anymore, they were stars. Celebrities whose images carried beyond the field. This, in turn, attracted advertisers eager to associate with the growing sport. By the end of the 1950s, the NFL had tasted television's power and knew it was the future. The league began centralizing control of broadcast rights, laying the groundwork for the massive TV deals of later decades. The seeds were planted for what would eventually become the Super Bowl era, when the NFL would dominate the television landscape like no other sport. But the 1950s also highlighted tensions. Smaller market teams worried they couldn't compete for national exposure. College football feared losing its spotlight as pro football grew more glamorous on screen. Owners debated how much of their product to give away through television. Yet, despite these conflicts, the direction was clear. Football and television were becoming inseparable. Looking back, it's almost impossible to imagine the NFL without TV. But in the 1950s, this was still a daring experiment. The cameras were primitive, the broadcasts clunky, and the audience uncertain. And yet, from those shaky early steps came the foundation of the modern NFL empire. The television revolution transformed the sport, amplifying its reach, shaping its stars, and cementing its place in American culture. Football, once just a Sunday afternoon pastime for a few thousand fans in the stands, was becoming a national ritual. And it was the flickering black and white screen in the living room that made it possible. As we move forward, the story deepens. For while television brought fame and fortune to the NFL, it also brought pressure, scrutiny, and change. Players would find themselves in the public eye like never before, their lives dissected, their performances immortalized. In the next segment, we'll explore how this new visibility reshaped, not just the league, but the very identity of the men who played the game. Television did not just change the way fans experienced football, it changed the men on the field. The arrival of TV cameras in the 1950s and the booming popularity of broadcast games reshaped the very identity of the NFL player. Before, they were anonymous, tough men who played a brutal sport for modest pay and little fame. After television, they became something closer to performers-athletes whose every move, gesture, and even mistake could be replayed, dissected, and remembered. The spotlight created new expectations, new pressures, and a new image of what it meant to be a professional football player. For decades, most players could walk down the street without being recognized. Even the stars of the 1940s and early 1950s were local heroes at best. Newspapers carried their names, maybe a few photos, but they weren't household figures in the way baseball legends like Joe DiMaggio or Jackie Robinson were. Baseball dominated headlines and radio waves, while football still lived in the background. That all began to change when TV networks realized football's pace and intensity translated beautifully to the screen. As games were broadcast nationally, suddenly faces mattered. Camera crews zoomed in on quarterbacks lining up under center, on running backs crouched and ready to explode through the line, on linemen snarling in the trenches. For the first time, millions of fans at home could see what these men looked like, how they carried themselves, and how they reacted in moments of triumph or failure. Players were no longer just names in print. They became living, breathing characters in a drama unfolding every Sunday. That shift forced athletes to think about themselves differently. A missed block in 1948 might have been forgotten by Monday. A missed block in 1958 could be replayed on highlight reels across the country, haunting a player for weeks. The visibility raised the stakes. Suddenly, men had to worry not only about what their coaches thought, but also about what the public thought. The audience wasn't just in the stadium anymore. The audience was America. Television also began shaping the physical expectations of the players. The medium rewarded the spectacular. A long pass, a bone-rattling hit, a dazzling run, these became the plays that defined a man's reputation. The camera didn't capture the subtle brilliance of a lineman grinding in the mud for 60 minutes, but it did capture the running back breaking free for a 50-yard score. That meant stars emerged not just from production, but from visibility. A player who looked good on TV had a chance to become something greater than just an athlete. He could become a celebrity. This was the beginning of the NFL's fascination with marketable stars. Quarterbacks with strong arms and confident swagger, receivers with leaping grabs, running backs with explosive bursts, these were the men who benefited most from TV exposure. Linemen, kickers, and defenders still did the dirty work, but their recognition rarely reached the same level. The visual nature of television created a hierarchy of fame, where skill combined with spectacle created legends. Yet television also brought new pressures. Players who once earned a modest salary and supplemented their income with off-season jobs now found themselves in the public eye. Expectations grew. Fans wanted them to look and act like stars. That meant dressing sharper, speaking more confidently, and living with a new kind of scrutiny. Every misstep could be amplified. A fight on the field, a poor performance, even behavior off the field, suddenly it all mattered in a way it hadn't before. Consider how Johnny Unitas rose to fame. Before TV, a player like Unitas, quiet, modest, almost unassuming, might have gone unnoticed outside Baltimore. But television turned him into the face of the modern quarterback. The 1958 NFL championship game, dubbed the greatest game ever played, beamed his cool command and precise passes into millions of homes. Overnight, Unitas wasn't just a Baltimore hero. He was a national icon. Fans wanted to imitate his flat-top haircut, his calm demeanor, and his almost machine-like approach to the game. Television didn't just record his greatness, it created it. And with that creation came responsibility. Players had to maintain a certain image because television was unforgiving. A moment of frustration, a display of weakness, or even a slip in discipline could be captured forever. Many athletes struggled under that weight. They were no longer just playing for their teammates or their city. They were playing for an invisible audience of millions, and the pressure to perform cleanly and consistently was immense. Television also influenced how coaches treated their players. A coach might tolerate a sloppy uniform or a fiery temper. But with TV cameras recording everything, appearance and discipline became paramount. Teams wanted to project professionalism. Players were expected to be not just tough but polished, not just competitors but ambassadors for the sport. The league itself leaned into this shift, branding football as a family-friendly, all-American pastime. That image relied heavily on the players looking the part on screen. What's fascinating is how television even began shaping body types. The medium magnified size and speed. Bigger players looked even more imposing on screen, while faster players looked like blur streaks of excitement. Coaches began valuing athletes who popped visually as well as statistically. A bruising fullback or towering lineman could become a symbol of dominance, not just a cog in the machine. The spectacle of size and speed became part of football's appeal, and players were encouraged to mold themselves into figures who looked extraordinary when broadcast into America's living rooms. There's also the human side of this transformation. Many players came from working-class backgrounds. They were sons of steelworkers, farmers, and factory men. Suddenly, they were thrust into a spotlight that demanded they act like celebrities. Some embraced it. Others struggled with the expectations. The balance between being an everyday man and being a star became one of the defining tensions of the television era. Television also gave rise to endorsements. For the first time, a player's face could sell products. The men who looked good on TV could now appear in commercials, from shaving cream to automobiles. That meant money, but it also meant responsibility. You weren't just playing football anymore, you were representing a brand. The NFL player was slowly transforming from a blue-collar athlete into a marketable personality. And that transition began squarely in the 1950s. And while the opportunities were immense, so were the demands. Television made legends, but it also demanded perfection. A great game could make you a hero to millions. A bad one could cement you as a national punchline. The margin for error shrank. Careers began to hinge not only on performance, but on perception. In a way, the players became actors in an unscripted play, judged not just for their ability, but for their charisma, poise, and ability to shine in the spotlight. By the end of the 1950s, the NFL player had become something entirely new. No longer anonymous, no longer hidden in the trenches, he was now a figure America recognized, admired, and critiqued. Television created heroes, but it also exposed flaws. It lifted men into the stratosphere of fame, but also held them accountable to standards far beyond the gridiron. This was the dawn of the modern NFL starman who had to balance skill, toughness, and character, all under the relentless gaze of the camera. And as we'll see in the next chapter, this transformation wasn't just about fame. It was about money, power, and the birth of football as big business. Television didn't just reshape the players, it reshaped their futures. By the end of the 1950s, television was no longer just a shiny new gadget sitting in American living rooms. It had become a cultural force, a national storyteller. And for the National Football League, it was about to become the lifeblood of its future. The league had grown up in an era of ticket stubs, community loyalty, and gate receipts as the primary measure of success. But television promised something entirely different. It promised scale, reach, visibility, and money, unlike anything professional football had ever seen before. And that money changed everything. In the early days, owners had built their financial model around filling stadiums. That was the golden rule. Sell enough tickets, keep the stands full, and you survive another season. For struggling franchises in the 1940s and early 50s, there was always the fear that a string of bad weather games or a losing season could sink a team. Football wasn't guaranteed stability like baseball. Baseball had long seasons and daily coverage in newspapers. Football had 12 games and a prayer that enough people would show up on Sundays. But then television executives walked into the owners' meetings with a new proposal. Let the cameras in and let the networks pay for the privilege of showing America the game. At first, it was a trickle. Local broadcasts, regional deals. A few $100s exchanged between stations and owners were not yet convinced that this new medium would be worth the trouble. But by the mid-1950s, the numbers spoke louder than any doubt. Audiences were skyrocketing. Families who couldn't afford a ticket or who lived hundreds of miles away suddenly became part of the NFL experience. Television allowed the game to leap beyond geography. Suddenly, the Cleveland Browns weren't just Cleveland's S team. They were America's team for anyone who tuned in. And with every additional household that tuned in, networks were willing to pay more. That was when owners realized the NFL's real product wasn't just football anymore, it was the broadcast of football. Television revenue changed the calculus for everyone involved. For owners, it meant stability and leverage. No longer were they living and dying on cold weather games in November, or whether their local market had enough fans. The league could pool its television money, divide it equally, and ensure that even small market teams had a fighting chance. This principle of revenue sharing, radical for its time, became the backbone of the NFL's business model. Think about it. In most industries, the biggest players hoard resources, consolidate power, and crush their competition. But in the NFL of the late 1950s, there was an awakening. The only way for the league to truly grow was for every team to be financially healthy. No one wanted a league where 2 or 3 dynasties thrived while everyone else collapsed. Television made it possible to create parity, just in talent, but in economics. For players, television money was equally transformative, though in a more complicated way. Salaries, once modest and often supplemented by off-season jobs, began to climb. A quarterback who might have made $12,000 a year suddenly had leverage. Fans were tuning in to see him throw touchdown passes every Sunday, and that visibility meant value. For the first time, players could point to numbers beyond attendance ratings. Sponsorships, TV highlights, and argue that their contribution deserved greater compensation. But here's where it gets complicated. While television money increased the pot, owners weren't exactly eager to give it away. Many held on tightly to the idea that players were lucky just to be playing at all, that the glory of the game should be rewarded enough. The result? A brewing tension. Players began whispering about unions, about organizing, about fighting for their fair share. And though the full clash wouldn't erupt until the 1960s, the seeds were planted in this era, watered by television revenue. Beyond economics, television money transformed the very image of the NFL. Networks wanted storylines. They wanted stars. They wanted marketable personalities who could sell not only touchdowns, but soap, cars, and beer during commercial breaks. The league, once faceless and raw, started leaning into identity. Teams became brands. Players became icons. Look at Johnny Unitas, the Baltimore Colts quarterback. Without television, he might have remained a regional legend, a blue-collar hero known to Colts fans and little more. But with the 1958 NFL championship game, the so-called greatest game ever played, televised live, Unitas became a household name. Millions of Americans who had never seen a pro football game watched him orchestrate a comeback in sudden death overtime. That one broadcast didn't just elevate Unitas, it elevated the entire sport. It proved that the NFL wasn't just entertainment, it was prime-time entertainment. The networks quickly realized that football was unlike any other sport for television. Baseball had history, but it was slow. Basketball was exciting, but it didn't yet have the same cultural foothold. Football had pace, drama, and violence that fit neatly into TV's rhythms. Every play was a story, every drive a chapter, every game a mini-epic that could be packaged, narrated, and broadcast into living rooms across America. This new reality forced the NFL to think bigger. Suddenly, it wasn't just about building a team, it was about building a product. Stadiums began modernizing. Halftime shows grew in scale. Camera angles, replays, and commentary evolved to keep audiences hooked. And while football was still rugged and violent, there was a growing awareness that television audiences preferred clarity. They wanted to see the ball, the strategy, the human faces beneath the helmets. Slowly but surely, the league began adapting rules, uniforms, and even officiating for the cameras. This symbiotic relationship between the NFL and television was the beginning of a financial juggernaut. Networks paid more because football drew viewers. Owners invested more because television guaranteed return. Sponsors paid more because football delivered audiences in droves. And the cycle fed itself, year after year, deal after deal. By the dawn of the 1960s, the NFL was no longer simply a sports league. It was an entertainment empire in the making, built on the back of television money. That money paid for stadiums, for scouting, for promotions. It kept struggling franchises alive. It allowed the league to expand, to think nationally, to dream of coast-to-coast rivalries that would capture America's imagination. But perhaps the most lasting change was cultural. Television didn't just bring football to fans. It brought football into the heart of American identity. Sunday afternoons became ritual. Families gathered around their TV sets, not just to watch a game, but to participate in a national event. The NFL became part of the American calendar, woven into the rhythm of weekends and holidays. What began as a few cameras on the sidelines of muddy fields had become the foundation of the NFL's future. Without television money, the league might have remained a regional curiosity, forever chasing baseball and boxing for cultural relevance. With it, football began its march toward dominance. But every shift has consequences. And as television's dollars flowed into the league, its influence only grew. The networks that funded football would eventually demand more power, more control, and more say over how the game was played, packaged, and delivered. That battle between sport and spectacle, between purity and profit, was just beginning. And in the next chapter, we'll see how television didn't just transform the business of football. It transformed the culture of America itself. By the dawn of the 1960s, the NFL was no longer just a sport. It was a product, a living, breathing spectacle, carefully packaged for America's living rooms. But while television had begun to change the league's visibility, it was the arrival of sponsors and commercialization that transformed football into big business. Suddenly, it wasn't only about the touchdowns, tackles, or championships. It was about who could sell the most beer, who could put their logo on the stadium walls, and who could align their brand with the gladiators of Sunday afternoon. In the 1950s, football sponsorship was modest, almost quaint. A local car dealership might sponsor a halftime radio show. A small soda bottler might hand out free drinks at a high school field where professional teams sometimes practiced. The money was minimal, and so was the reach. The NFL, compared to Major League Baseball, was still considered a second-tier property for advertisers. Baseball had Babe Ruth, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle. Football had greats too, guys like Otto Graham, Doak Walker, and Johnny Unitas. But the marketing machine around them was not yet firing. That was about to change. The turning point came when television advertisers realized something crucial. Football fans were a captive audience. Unlike baseball, with its leisurely pace and long afternoons, football was structured perfectly for television breaks. Every huddle, every timeout, every quarter stoppage became a golden opportunity to sell a product, and companies were eager to jump in. Beer brands, cigarette companies, and car manufacturers led the charge. They saw football not just as a sport, but as a cultural gathering where men, families, and eventually entire communities sat together to watch. To have their brand connected with that ritual meant loyalty, recognition, and dollars. Take beer, for instance. By the late 50s, brands like Schlitz, Pabst Blue Ribbon, and later Budweiser were weaving themselves into the football fabric. Their commercials didn't just sell drinks, they sold identity. The idea of sitting with friends, watching the game, and holding a cold beer became as much a part of Sunday as the game itself. Cigarettes were just as prominent, in an era when smoking was not yet associated with health risks in the public. Mind players appeared in ads, coaches, endorsed brands, and commercials. Aired during games promising smoothness and flavor alongside images of touchdowns and cheers. But this wave of sponsorship went beyond products. It started shaping the league itself. Teams realized that corporate money meant stability. Stadiums began experimenting with signage. Uniforms stayed relatively untouched at first, but team programs, media guides, and even press releases started carrying advertisements. It was subtle, but it was the beginning of something massive: the transformation of the NFL from a game into a marketplace. For players, this was both an opportunity and a strange new world. A handful of stars began to land endorsement deals. Johnny Unitas, the quiet, flat-top quarterback who defined the Baltimore Colts, appeared in ads for shaving razors and department stores. Frank Gifford, with his movie star looks, landed commercial work that extended beyond sports pages into mainstream America. These deals were small by modern standards, but they signaled the birth of the athlete as spokesperson in professional football. Still, there was tension. Many players felt that the money pouring into the league from television and advertisers was on trickling down. Salaries in the late 50s remained modest compared to the revenue being generated. Owners and league officials justified this by saying football was still growing, but the truth was clear. The commercialization of the NFL created wealth, and the struggle over who would benefit from that wealth was only beginning. And yet, there was no denying the effect sponsors had on the game's perception. Commercialization made football mainstream. A sport once seen as too violent or regional became a unifying spectacle. The brands attached to it gave it legitimacy in the eyes of Middle America. If General Motors was backing the NFL, then the NFL was worth watching. If the league had major beer brands advertising during its games, then football wasn't just a pastime, it was an institution. This era also revealed how sponsorship shaped storytelling. Advertisers didn't just want to sell products, they wanted narratives that fit their image. They wanted the rugged quarterback who could sell razors. They wanted the all-American halfback who could sell family sedans. They wanted the iron-willed coach who embodied toughness, discipline, and reliability. In some ways, sponsors helped craft the mythology of the NFL's heroes. Players weren't just athletes anymore, they were symbols, icons, and ambassadors for consumer culture. By the end of the 50s, the seeds of modern sports marketing had been planted. Stadiums began to resemble billboards. Television broadcasts leaned heavily on sponsored segments. "This halftime show is brought to you by" became a familiar phrase in households across America. Even the way games were scheduled began to shift with television, and sponsors influencing kickoff times to maximize viewership and, by extension, commercial value. But the real story was how sponsorship permanently tied football to American identity. The NFL wasn't just selling a sport, it was selling a lifestyle. Commercials promised that to be part of football culture was to be part of the nation's fabric. Watching on Sundays, drinking the right beer, driving the right Corvette, all became part of the package. And it worked. Fans didn't just consume the game, they consumed the products that wrapped themselves around it. Of course, looking back, some of it feels jarring. Cigarette ads featuring players now read like relics of a bygone era. Beer ads that leaned heavily on masculinity stereotypes feel dated. But, in the context of the time, they made sense. America in the late 50s was booming economically, and football mirrored that boom. The league was expanding, players were gaining recognition, and advertisers were fueling the engine. The commercialization of the NFL in this era laid the foundation for the massive empire we see today. Modern Super Bowl commercials, million-dollar endorsement deals, stadium naming rights, all of it began with those early experiments in sponsorship. What started as a local car dealership putting its name on a game program evolved into billion-dollar corporations, shaping how football was played, consumed, and remembered. And so, by 1960, the NFL wasn't just a league anymore. It was a business, a marketplace, and a stage. Every touchdown carried not just the roar of the crowd, but the echo of advertisers who realized that football wasn't just entertainment, it was the heartbeat of American commerce. As we move forward, the story becomes even clearer. The NFL was never going to be the same. Sponsors and commercialization weren't just influences. They were catalysts that turned a scrappy, often violent sport into a polished, marketable juggernaut. And in the next chapter, we'll explore how this shift didn't just change the money around the league, it began to change the very culture inside it. Because when business takes over a game, it doesn't just affect the balance sheet. It affects the locker room, the fans, the traditions, and the very soul of the sport. By the late 1950s, something strange was happening to football. The game was exploding in visibility, in attention, and in money, but many of the men who played it, coached it, and even loved it were starting to feel like the sport itself was slowly being reshaped into something unrecognizable. Television networks wanted games at specific times to maximize viewership. Sponsors wanted clean-cut players who could fit into advertisements. Owners wanted more money from new stadiums, TV deals, and product teens. Somewhere along the way, the essence of football, the toughness, the purity, the sense of it being a game for working-class men who loved nothing more than hitting hard and earning. Victory through sweat seemed to be at risk, and that is where the clash began. In the 1930s and 1940s, football had been a rugged, almost niche sport compared to baseball, which was America's pastime. College football often drew more attention than the professional game, and the NFL was still struggling to find its place. But after World War II, as television sets spread across American households, the NFL suddenly had a new stage. What had once been a regional, almost gritty Sunday afternoon pastime was now prime-time entertainment. That was intoxicating for owners and investors. But for players, the attention didn't always feel like respect. It often felt like they were being turned into products. Think of the typical 1950s football player. Most of them had off-season jobs working in factories, teaching school, selling insurance because their football salaries weren't enough to live on. They played for love, for pride, and for the chance at glory, not for fame. But suddenly, their images were being used to sell shaving cream, cigarettes, and beer. Men who spent their weekdays working second jobs were now showing up in glossy magazine spreads, promoting brands most of them couldn't even afford. The disconnect was jarring. Players began to voice frustration. They wanted fair compensation if their likeness was being used in commercials. But the league, still tightly controlled by owners, saw commercialization as a necessary evolution. To them, it wasn't about the players' voices. It was about the bigger picture, securing sponsors, selling out stadiums, and making football into a mass-market juggernaut. And yet, commercialization came with subtle cultural costs. Before television, football had been a raw, messy, sometimes violent sport played in the mud, snow, and grit of America's outdoor stadiums. Fans were mostly local, rooting for the hometown team with a kind of blue-collar loyalty. But as networks started broadcasting games nationwide, the NFL wanted a cleaner image. That meant tighter rules to cut down on brutal hits, uniforms that looked polished on screen, and players who presented themselves as wholesome American role models. The hard-drinking, chain-smoking, foul-mouthed culture of locker rooms didn't exactly fit into that ideal. The clash between authenticity and image played out in dramatic ways. For instance, teams were pressured to clean up their sidelines to make the broadcast more family-friendly. Players who once freely smoked or drank on team buses were now being reminded that sponsors didn't want that image associated with their products. Coaches who had once ruled with iron fists now had to accommodate television breaks and commercial slots that disrupted the rhythm of the game. For purists, this felt like an intrusion, a shift in power away from the players and coaches and toward the money men behind the scenes. There was also the question of identity. Football had been rooted in toughness, in authenticity, in the idea that it was a working man's game. Commercialization threatened to make it slick, staged, and corporate. Some players resisted the change outright. They mocked the idea of appearing in commercials, dismissed television executives as outsiders, and openly worried that football would lose its soul. Others, however, embraced the new era. For them, endorsements and sponsorships meant money, fame, and security. This division began to fracture locker rooms. Some men clung to the old-school vision of football as a brutal brotherhood of warriors. Others leaned into the new reality that football was not just a sport, but a business. And when a sport becomes a business, identity shifts. Fans noticed it too. Many longtime supporters grumbled that the NFL was becoming too polished, too showbiz. They remembered the days of muddy fields, freezing games, and players who seemed like neighbors rather than celebrities. Now, football was being piped into living rooms with commercials telling you which beer to drink or which car to drive. For some, it was thrilling. For others, it felt like the beginning of the end of football's innocence. The 1958 NFL championship game, dubbed the greatest game ever played, crystallized this tension. On one hand, it was a triumph for the sport, watched by millions and cementing the NFL's place as a national powerhouse. But behind the scenes, that game was also a carefully packaged product, choreographed by television networks and hyped by sponsors. For the first time, football was less about what happened on the field and more about how it was presented to the masses. And in that shift lay the seeds of conflict. Football was no longer just a game. It was becoming a commodity. The men on the field were not just players. They were assets in a larger marketing machine. Commercialization brought growth, but it also brought a creeping sense of disconnection between football's gritty reality and its glossy image. That clash between football's authentic culture and its commercialized future would only grow sharper in the decades to come. But in the late 1950s, it was just beginning to surface. Owners, networks, and sponsors saw dollar signs. Players saw their identities being reshaped. Fans saw their beloved game being pulled in two directions, toward tradition on one side and toward business on the other. It raised the central question: could football remain true to itself while also embracing the forces of money, media, and commercialization? Or was the very soul of the game destined to be rewritten in the pursuit of profit? The answer would come in the years that followed, as the NFL leaned harder and harder into commercialization. But in the 1950s, that cultural clash was raw, fresh, and unresolved. It left both players and fans wondering what kind of game football was about to become. The 1960s were a decade of rebellion in America. Young people questioned authority. Protesters filled the streets. Musicians rewrote the rules of culture. And athletes, for the first time in professional football, began to look at the world beyond the gridiron and ask themselves a dangerous question: what about us? For decades, players had been expected to act like soldiers in a war they could never win. They were supposed to keep quiet, to fall in line, to treat their careers as if they were lucky just to be there. Owners controlled every detail, from salaries to endorsements, from training camp curfews to off-season employment. The NFL was still growing, still desperate to present itself as the ultimate American sport. But as television money poured in and sponsors lined up to cash in on the image of toughness and tradition, the men on the field started to notice something. They were the product. They were the ones getting hit, bleeding, limping into Monday mornings with broken ribs and fractured jaws. Yet compared to what the owners and networks were pocketing, their piece of the pie looked smaller and smaller. This is where the story begins to shift from blind loyalty to a new kind of awareness. The NFL Players Association had been around since the mid-1950s, but in those early years, it was more of a formality than a force. Owners didn't fear it. The league didn't respect it. The union had no real leverage, no legal teeth. But as the money flowing into football grew louder than the sound of pads cracking on Sunday afternoons, the players realized something had to change. And make no mistake, change would not come easy. Picture a linebacker in 1965. He is 27 years old, his knees already shot from years of bone-rattling collisions. He makes maybe $15,000 a season, enough to support his family, but not enough to build any kind of safety net. In the off-season, he sells cars at a local dealership, smiling through back pain so he can make commission. Meanwhile, the team's owner is negotiating television deals worth millions. The network is selling ads during games for record sums. Beer companies, car manufacturers, shaving cream brands, they are all using the image of men like him to sell the American dream. But when his playing days are over, what does he have? A handshake. A pat on the back. Maybe a line on his resume if he's lucky. By the mid-60s, this unfairness became impossible to ignore. And the louder the television broadcast, the more glaring the silence of player rights became. The tension really began to boil when players started pushing for basic benefits, things that today we take for granted. Health insurance, pension plans, minimum salaries, simple guarantees that a career in professional football wouldn't leave a man crippled, broke, and forgotten. The owners resisted at every turn, clinging to control like it was part of the playbook. Their argument was always the same. Football was a privilege, not a right. If the players didn't like it, they could go work somewhere else. But football had become bigger than that. The game was now a national spectacle, broadcast into millions of homes. And the players knew that without them, there was no product to sell. In 1968, the powder keg finally exploded. The NFL Players Association voted to strike. It was the first time in league history that players refused to take the field until their voices were heard. Their demands were not excessive. They wanted pensions, better pay scales, and recognition of their union. The owners scoffed. They thought the players would fold quickly, that loyalty to the game would outweigh any push for dignity. But for weeks, players held the line. Practices were canceled. Preseason games were threatened. And suddenly, the league's shiny new television partners began to sweat. Here's the thing about television. It thrives on predictability. Networks sell airtime to advertisers months in advance. Sponsors expect games to run on schedule. If players were willing to walk out, if the carefully planned machine of Sunday football started to wobble, millions of dollars could evaporate. The strike of 1968 didn't win everything overnight, but it cracked the foundation of owner dominance. It forced the league to acknowledge the union and paved the way for real negotiations in the years to come. But the pushback wasn't just financial, it was cultural. The players of the late 60s began to see themselves not just as athletes, but as workers in an industry that exploited their bodies and identities. They looked at what was happening in the country: the civil rights movement, student protests, the rise of labor activism, and realized they were part of something larger. They, too, had a right to speak up, to demand fairness, to question authority. Some players risked their careers by speaking too loudly. Black athletes in particular carried an even heavier burden. They weren't just fighting for pensions and paychecks. They were fighting for respect in a league that still carried the stains of racism. When they stood up, they weren't just pushing against owners. They were pushing against a culture that wanted them to be silent, grateful, and invisible. These were dangerous waters to navigate. The NFL's image was built on order, discipline, and tradition. The idea of players challenging the system clashed with the narrative of football as the ultimate American brotherhood. But rebellion has a way of spreading, and once the players saw cracks in the wall, there was no turning back. This period marked a turning point. It was the beginning of football as we know it today, not just a sport, but a labor battlefield, a business negotiation, a cultural mirror. The pushback of the late 60s was messy, filled with conflict, sacrifice, and betrayal. Some players lost their jobs. Some were blackballed, but the seeds had been planted. The NFL would never again be a place where players were expected to shut up and play without question. As television cameras captured the drama on the field, another drama played out behind the scenes. It was the story of workers demanding respect, of athletes daring to value their humanity as much as their performance. And that, perhaps more than any touchdown or championship, is what reshaped the NFL heading into the 1970s. The rebellion of the players was not a side story. 'Twas the main event. Without it, there is no free agency, no collective bargaining, no multi-million-dollar contracts. The pushback of the 60s turned football from a league controlled entirely by its owners into a battleground, where players had a voice that would only grow louder as the decades rolled on. And so, as the 1960s closed and the NFL prepared for a new decade, the game itself was forever changed. The gladiators had finally found their roar, and the league would never again be able to silence them. Because the truth was out. The men who sacrificed their bodies on Sundays deserved more than scraps. They deserved a seat at the table, and now they were willing to fight for it. The year was 1966, and professional football stood on the edge of something seismic. For more than a decade, the National Football League had dominated the landscape, ruling with tradition, prestige, and a steady fan base. But in the early 1960s, a rival league had emerged, the upstart American Football League. Brash, colorful, and unapologetically bold, the AFL brought in new owners with deep pockets, fresh ideas about marketing, and a willingness to challenge the NFL at its core. This rivalry wasn't just about two leagues competing for championships, it was about power, money, and identity. And caught in the middle were the players, whose roles were about to change forever. For years, NFL players had little leverage. Salaries were modest by professional standards, contracts were rigid, and there was no real bargaining power for the men who made the game what it was. The league controlled everything: who could play, how long they could stay, and what they would be paid. The existence of the AFL changed that dynamic overnight. Suddenly, young college stars were being courted by two suitors instead of one. Teams from each league would bid against one another for talent, driving salaries higher and giving players something they had never truly had before: options. The bidding wars became legendary. Joe Namath is perhaps the most famous example on Alabama. Quarterback with charisma and arm strength, who became the face of the AFL in 1965. Namath was drafted by both the St. Louis Cardinals of the NFL and the New York Jets of the AFL. The Cardinals offered him a respectable deal. The Jets countered with something unheard of at the time: a $427,000 contract, the richest in football history to that point. Namath chose the Jets, shocking the establishment and sending a message that the AFL was not only here to stay, but capable of outspending its rival. For players, this moment was revolutionary. For the first time, they could use the leverage of two leagues competing against each other to demand better pay. Rookies who once had to accept whatever the NFL offered them now had bargaining chips. Veterans saw their value rise as the threat of jumping leagues gave them negotiating power. It was no longer the owners dictating every term. Players could walk into contract talks with confidence, knowing they had another option across the street. But this wasn't just about money. The AFL also brought a cultural clash. The NFL was buttoned up, rooted in tradition, and marketed as the sport of Middle America. The AFL was flashier, more daring, with teams willing to experiment with passing-heavy offenses, colorful uniforms, and a more aggressive push into television. The contrast created two distinct football cultures, and players had to decide not only where they wanted to play, but who they wanted to represent. Did they want the prestige and security of the NFL, or the money and flair of the AFL? This collision of cultures reached its boiling point when both leagues began competing for supremacy on the field as well as in business. The 1967 Super Bowl, officially called the AFL-NFL World Championship game, was supposed to prove once and for all which league reigned supreme. The NFL's Green Bay Packers crushed the AFL's Kansas City Chiefs, and the NFL faithful scoffed at the idea that the two leagues were equal. But just 2 years later, Namath's Jets stunned the Baltimore Colts in Super Bowl III. And suddenly, the world saw the AFL as a legitimate force. That victory didn't just vindicate the AFL, it validated the players who had chosen to take a chance on the new league. Behind the scenes, owners from both leagues began to realize the rivalry was unsustainable. The bidding wars were draining resources, TV networks were being forced to choose sides, and the constant battle for legitimacy was splitting fans. By 1966, merger talks had begun, and by 1970, the two leagues officially combined to form the modern NFL. For the fans, this was a monumental change, but for the players, it was life-altering. The merger represented both opportunity and risk. On one hand, salaries had risen dramatically in just a few short years. The power of competition had forced owners to open their wallets, and the days of meager contracts were fading fast. Players were traveling better, eating better, and being treated with more respect than ever before. They weren't just employees anymore, they were assets whose value had been proven by the war between leagues. On the other hand, the merger also meant the end of the leverage that came with two leagues. Once the NFL and AFL were united, there was only one league again. Without a rival bidding for their services, players faced the risk of returning to the old days, where owners could dictate terms with little resistance. But something had changed. Players had tasted bargaining power. They had seen their true worth reflected in dollar signs and recognition, and that awareness couldn't be erased. The merger also changed how players viewed themselves culturally. The AFL had embraced more African American players at a time when the NFL was still cautious in certain regions. Teams like the Kansas City Chiefs and Buffalo Bills were integrated at levels that mirrored social changes sweeping across America in the 1960s. The merger forced the NFL to catch up, creating a more diverse and dynamic league. For players, this wasn't just about paychecks, it was about progress, identity, and being part of a sport that reflected the world outside the stadiums. Television played its role as well. With the merger came more national broadcasts, bigger audiences, and a spotlight unlike anything football had seen before. Players who had once been local heroes were now national figures, household names appearing in living rooms across the country every Sunday. This new platform gave them influence and visibility, reshaping not only their careers but their lives outside the game. But it was also about awakening. Players were no longer passive participants in the sport. They were advocates for themselves, for fairness, and for the game's future. That shift in awareness would fuel the battles to come, for free agency, for labor rights, for safety, and for respect. The collision of the AFL and NFL did not just create a modern football empire, it created modern football players. Men who understood their worth demanded to be heard and shaped the league not just with their bodies, but with their voices. And as the dust settled on the merger, a new question emerged. With players now more conscious of their value, how would they wield that power in the years to come? That is where our story leads next. This segment, the rise of the Players' Union and the early fights for labor rights in a sport that was about to become America's true pastime. The year is the early 1960s, and American football is on the verge of a cultural tug-of-war. On one side, you have the NFL, the establishment disciplined, traditional, steeped in decades of rigid hierarchy and a seriousness that felt almost militaristic. On the other, the AFL bursts into existence like a rebel younger brother, full of swagger, color, and a willingness to do things differently. This collision of cultures was more than just a business battle, it was a clash of identities. The AFL arrived with a mission: shake up football. Where the NFL was cautious and protective, the AFL was experimental and bold. It launched teams in cities the NFL wouldn't touch, like Oakland, Kansas City, and Houston. It embraced passing when the NFL still leaned heavily on grinding, run-first strategies. Its broadcasts came with bright colors, faster pacing, and personalities larger than life. Suddenly, football wasn't just about the Sunday ritual, it was about entertainment, style, and drawing in new fans who wanted something fresh. Players felt this difference instantly. A rookie who got cut from an NFL roster suddenly had a lifeline in the AFL. Competition meant more jobs, more bargaining power, and for the first time, the ability to test your worth in another league. Imagine being a linebacker who is dismissed by an NFL coach as too small only to get a starting role with an AFL team that valued your speed. The AFL didn't just create opportunities, it created confidence. It gave athletes the courage to demand better treatment and more respect, because suddenly, there was choice. And choice changes everything. The two leagues didn't just compete on the field, they fought for players. Salaries, once stagnant in the NFL, began to climb because the AFL was willing to pay. The NFL offered you $20,000, the AFL might swoop in with $30,000 and the promise of being a face of their franchise. For players who had lived on the edge of financial insecurity, this was life-changing. The competition injected freedom into a system that had long been about control. But money wasn't the only difference. Culture mattered. The AFL embraced flash. Coaches allowed players more individuality, letting them celebrate touchdowns, grow out their sideburns, and play with flair. The NFL still demanded the buttoned-up, stoic image of the company man. It was a reflection of America itself in the 1960s, a society questioning authority, bracing expression, and yearning for change. Television, once again, amplified the differences. AFL broadcasts leaned into excitement. Their games were aired on NBC in vibrant color, which made the league feel futuristic compared to the NFL's black and white tradition. Broadcasters hyped personalities, told player stories, and made the league feel like a show. Kids growing up in households with color TVs were drawn to the AFL's spectacle. It was football reimagined for a new generation. Still, the NFL scoffed at its rival. Old guard owners and coaches dismissed the AFL as a gimmick league. They saw the razzle-dazzle, the wide-open offenses, and the unproven franchises, and called it unserious. But beneath the ridicule was a growing sense of unease. The NFL realized it could no longer ignore this rival. Fans were paying attention, sponsors were noticing, and perhaps most importantly, players were starting to speak up. For the athletes caught in the middle, the era was both thrilling and confusing. Some described it as living in two different football worlds. In the NFL, you felt like a soldier in a disciplined army. In the AFL, you felt like a showman, part of something experimental and alive. A lineman might play in the NFL on Sunday and then get a call from an AFL scout on Monday, offering a raise and a chance to play in a city hungry for heroes. That kind of leverage was unheard of in the 1950s, and it was changing the psychology of being a professional athlete. Fans, too, felt the tension. The older generation leaned toward the NFL, loyal to its history and prestige. The younger crowd gravitated toward the AFL, seduced by its flash and color. Stadiums became cultural battlegrounds, with fans not just cheering teams but cheering styles, values, and visions of what football should become. The AFL also pioneered inclusivity in ways the NFL resisted. While the NFL had unspoken racial quotas that limited how many black players could be on a team, the AFL welcomed talent wherever it could be found. It scouted historically black colleges aggressively, bringing in players who might have been overlooked by the NFL. This not only made the AFL more competitive, but also sent a powerful cultural message: football was for everyone, not just those who fit the mold the NFL had long upheld. Players who felt marginalized by the NFL found opportunity and respect in the AFL. And that left a lasting imprint on the sport. The battle reached a boiling point as both leagues competed for supremacy. Salaries soared, rivalries deepened, and the media fueled the fire with every signing war and game day comparison. The players loved it because for the first time they held the power to choose, to negotiate, to be valued. The leagues might have seen themselves as business competitors, but for the men on the field, it was liberation. And yet, beneath all the bravado and competition, there was an unspoken truth. This could not last forever. Two leagues, both demanding attention, both pulling in talent, both clawing for television contracts, meant one thing: the eventual collision. Fans wanted to know who was better. Players wanted to prove themselves against the best. And executives knew the money would only stretch so far before something had to give. The AFL had brought energy, innovation, and inclusivity. The NFL had tradition, stability, and prestige. Both had their strengths. Both had their flaws. But together, they were creating a storm that would change football forever. This wasn't just a business rivalry, it was an identity crisis for the sport itself. Would football remain the stiff, controlled game of the old guard? Or would it embrace the flash, the individuality, and the boldness of the new? That tension was the beating heart of the 1960s football revolution. As the leagues hurtled toward their inevitable collision, fans and players alike could feel it. The game was no longer what it used to be. Something bigger was coming. Something that would define the future of American sports. And that brings us to the next chapter of our journey, the moment when this rivalry stopped being a sideshow and became a full-on war for supremacy. Because next, we dive into the explosive first clashes between the NFL and AFL, where pride, power, and the very soul of football were on the line. The first time an NFL player lined up across from an AFL player, it wasn't just football. It was a collision of pride, of money, of survival itself. The NFL, with its 40-year legacy and iron grip on tradition, saw the new American Football League as little more than a noisy sideshow, a backyard carnival compared to the cathedral of professional football. The AFL, meanwhile, saw every snap as a chance to carve legitimacy into stone. And so, when the two leagues finally collided on the field in the mid-1960s, the stadium became something more than a sports arena. It became a battlefield for the very future of the game. The earliest preseason exhibition games, those hastily arranged clash, were never truly about preseason tune-ups. They were blood feuds. NFL veterans sneered across the line of scrimmage, calling their opponents Bush League boys. For the AFL squads, those taunts were fuel. Coaches told their men flat out, "This is your war. If you lose, the world writes you off. If you win, you change history." From the opening kickoff, the tone was set. These weren't routine August games where players jogged through assignments. They were street fights in helmets. NFL defenders hit late, driving knees into ribs under the pile. AFL linemen fought back with fists, grabbing face masks, clawing through pads. The referees, unsure how to manage such ferocity in what was supposed to be a tune-up, swallowed their whistles and let chaos reign. And in that chaos, something incredible happened. Sometimes the AFL didn't just hang on. They struck back. Take one of the most infamous early clashes, the Kansas City Chiefs. Fresh off AFL dominance, lining up against the Chicago Bears. The Bears, hard-nosed and proud, mocked the Chiefs in warm-ups, shouting across the field that they were about to get schooled. But by the second quarter, Chiefs quarterback Len Dawson was threading precise passes against the vaunted Bears secondary. Kansas City's speed and flair made the Bears look lumbering, predictable. By the final whistle, the AFL squad had not only competed, they had beaten the NFL at its own game. For the first time, newspapers couldn't ignore it. "Maybe they belong" became the quiet headline. And it wasn't just Kansas City. The Jets, with a brash young quarterback named Joe Namath, would soon deliver moments that left NFL loyalists red-faced. When Namath launched deep spirals that connected again and again against established NFL defenses, fans watching couldn't help but ask, is this league really inferior, or have we been lied to? But the on-field brawls were only half the war. Off the field, the battle was every bit as vicious. Contracts became weapons. AFL owners, flush with television money, began offering NFL stars outrageous salaries to jump leagues. Some players took the bait, defecting in high-profile moves that embarrassed the NFL and emboldened the AFL. Suddenly, it wasn't just about who won on Sunday, it was about who could buy loyalty on Monday. That led to lawsuits, injunctions, and courtroom drama. Owners filed claims against each other, accusing the rival league of tampering and contract interference. Judges often had to determine which piece of paper a contract signed in the NFL or a richer one from the AFL was binding. For players, it was open season. They played one league against the other, bargaining for salaries that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Men who had once scraped by on part-time paychecks were suddenly walking into training camp with real financial security. The old guard hated it, but for the athletes, it was a revolution. And the media, they fanned the flames. Some reporters, loyal to the established NFL, called the AFL flashy frauds, dismissing their wide-open offenses and high-scoring games as circus acts. But other voices began to emerge, particularly from markets the NFL had long ignored: Houston, Buffalo, Oakland, Denver, cities where the AFL had planted flags. Their newspapers hailed the new league as visionary. Their broadcasts hyped the creativity, the risks, the energy. The rivalry played out not just in stadiums, but on front pages and nightly news highlights. For the fans, it became a question of identity. If you were a traditionalist, you wore your NFL loyalty like armor. But if you were young, restless, eager for something new, the AFL felt like rebellion. Their uniforms were brighter, their passing games bolder, their celebrations looser. They didn't look like the buttoned-up establishment. They looked like the future. Pride became the invisible force at the heart of every hit, every touchdown, every headline. The NFL clung to its past, desperate to prove its way was the only way. The AFL fought like outlaws, each victory another step toward survival. And those games, savage as they were, began to change the narrative. No longer could the NFL simply brush the AFL aside. Too many fans had seen with their own eyes that the inferior league could compete, sometimes even dominate. One of the most pivotal moments came not in the courtroom or the boardroom, but on the field, under the lights, when an AFL squad left an NFL powerhouse battered and embarrassed. The whispers started. If they can win here, maybe they can win anywhere. That seed of doubt grew. It crept into the minds of owners, broadcasters, and even players themselves. If the AFL wasn't going away, then maybe, just maybe, the two leagues would have to find another way forward. Still, the blood on the field couldn't be ignored. These games were dangerous, reckless affairs with injuries mounting from the sheer intensity. Players weren't just playing for wins, they were playing for validation, for dignity, for the right to be called real professionals. And when you put that much pride into a collision sport, the results were often brutal. But through the blood and the bruises, something undeniable was happening. Fans who once dismissed the AFL were buying tickets, turning on their televisions, picking sides. And television executives always hunting for drama realized that this rivalry was gold. The more the leagues hated each other, the more America watched. By the end of those first clashes, everyone knew the truth. This was bigger than sports. It was about legacy, power, and the very soul of professional football. On one side, the proud guardians of the past. On the other, the brash dreamers of the future. And somewhere between them, in the crunch of pads and the roar of the crowd, the next chapter of football history was waiting to be written. Because these early wars weren't just about proving who was better. They were about forcing the question no one wanted to ask out loud. Could the game survive with two warring leagues tearing it apart? Or would the battlefield of the 1960s give birth to something even greater? The answer was coming, but first, the war had to rage on. When we first began this journey, we asked a simple question. What was it really like to be an NFL player in those early decades when the sport was still carving its place in American life? And what we uncovered, layer by layer, was not a clean, polished story of gridiron glory. It was a story of blood, sweat, mud, uncertainty, and survival. It was the story of men who put everything on the line, not for fame, not for fortune, but because the game had hooked them deep in their bones. We followed them through violent practices that left bodies broken before the season even began. We stood beside rookies who endured hazing that blurred the line between ritual and cruelty. We heard the echoes of leather helmets cracking, of coaches barking commands, of men fighting not only for a spot on the roster, but for the right to keep chasing a dream that gave them meaning. These players lived in small apartments, shared cars to training camp, and often worked second jobs just to afford to keep playing. This was not the million-dollar empire we see today. This was survival. And yet out of that hardship grew something powerful. The players of those decades forged the foundation of the NFL we know now. They brought the grit. They brought the toughness. They brought the sacrifice. And slowly, the world began to notice. Television arrived like a tidal wave. Suddenly, America could see these warriors on Sunday afternoons, their collisions transmitted directly into living rooms. A sport that once belonged to the diehards of Midwestern cities became a national obsession. The bright lights, the frozen moments of black and white film. The first slow-motion replays football was no longer just a game. It was becoming an event. It was becoming culture. But television didn't just change the fans, changed the players. Suddenly, their image mattered. The way they moved, the way they looked, even the way they celebrated was all magnified. Sponsors began to circle, smelling opportunity. Advertisers realized that these men could sell more than tickets. They could sell beer, they could sell cars. They could sell an idea of toughness that Americans craved in a world changing too fast. And yet, here lay the paradox. The more money flowed into the league, the sharper the divide between the myth of football and the reality of those who played it. The myth was heroic players as titans, gladiators, legends. The reality was brutal players icing broken ribs, hiding concussions, taking painkillers just to walk onto the field. They were celebrated on television but forgotten once the cameras turned off. For every star who signed an endorsement deal, there were dozens of men who limped into retirement with nothing but scars. By the 1960s, the NFL and the AFL collided in a war that was part sport, part business, and part cultural drama. We saw how pride, contracts, lawsuits, and television rights reshaped the very fabric of the game. Players realized they had leverage, that their bodies, their labor, and their visibility mattered. Slowly, a consciousness grew. This wasn't just about surviving another practice. This was about securing respect, dignity, and a future. But even as the money multiplied and the Super Bowl was born, the essence of those early decades remained in the DNA of the sport. The mud, the blood, the hunger. That willingness to keep playing through pain because the game meant more than anything else. And now standing here in today's NFL, a multi-billion-dollar empire broadcast across the globe, we can look back and see the contrast more clearly than ever. Players today sign contracts worth more than the entire payroll of a 1950s franchise. They are protected by rules, union representation, and medical oversight that early players could only dream of. And yet, the echoes remain. Every time a lineman digs his cleats into the turf, every time a quarterback absorbs a crushing hit, every time a rookie wonders if he'll survive his first training camp hit, it's a reminder that football at its core hasn't changed. It still demands sacrifice, still extracts a price, and it still thrives because of the men willing to pay it. So what do we take away from this story? Maybe it's gratitude. Gratitude for the pioneers who played through conditions we can barely imagine, who built the league brick by brick with their own bodies. Gratitude for the moments of humanity, the laughter in locker rooms, the bonds of brotherhood, the knowledge that even in a brutal sport, compassion could survive. Maybe it's perspective. Perspective that while today's game dazzles us with high-definition highlights and billion-dollar contracts, the heart of football was never money. It was always the will to push past limits, to endure when others would quit, to play for something bigger than yourself. And maybe, above all, it's understanding. Understanding that every era of the NFL reflects not just the sport, but America itself. The 1950s game mirrored a nation still working class, still defined by struggle. The television boom reflected America's obsession with spectacle and mass culture. The merger reflected the growing corporate battles of an economy built on consolidation and power. And today's game reflects both the triumph and the tension of modern life of sport that is at once inspiring and dangerous. Beloved and criticized, glamorous and raw. As we close this journey, we return to the image of those early players mud-streaked, bruised, standing on frozen sidelines with their breath fogging in the air. They weren't playing for cameras. They weren't playing for $1 million deals. They were playing because something inside them demanded it. They were playing for pride, for belonging, for the roar of a crowd that made all the pain worth it. And in that sense, they weren't just shaping football. They were shaping us. They gave us a sport that became a ritual, a spectacle, a mirror of our own endurance. They gave us Sundays that mattered. They gave us a game that, for all its flaws, continues to unite communities, stir passions, and remind us of what humans will endure for love, for pride, and for legacy. So the next time you watch a kickoff, the next time you hear the crack of pads under stadium lights, remember this: you are not just watching the NFL of today. You are watching ghosts. You are watching every man who suited up in an era when the game was raw, unprotected, and uncertain. You are watching their spirit carried forward. The final whistle blows on this story, but the echoes remain. The men who built football gave us more than a sport. They gave us a symbol of resilience, a reflection of the human will, and a legacy that will outlive every stadium, every broadcast, and every generation. This is football. This is America. And this is their story.